A Commentary on Light on the Path. By Annie Bezanт, C.W. Ledbitер. Foreword. This book is merely a record of talks by Mr. C.W. Ledbitер, now Bishop Ledbitер, and myself on 3 famous books small in size but great in contents. We both hope that they will prove useful to aspirants, and even to those above that stage, since the talkers were older than the listeners, and had more experience in the life of discipleship. The talks were not given at one place only. We chatted to our friends at different times and places, chiefly at Udyar, London and Sydney. A vast quantity of notes were taken by the listeners. All that were available of these were collected and arranged. They were then condensed, and repetitions were eliminated. Unhappily there were found to be very few notes on the voice of the silence, fragment I, so we have utilized notes made at a class held by our good colleague, Mr. Ernest Wood, in Sydney, and incorporated these into Bishop Ledbitter's talks in that section. No notes of my own talks on this book were available, though I have spoken much upon it. Those talks are not recoverable. None of these talks have been published before, except some of Bishop Ledbitter's addresses to selected students on At the Feet of the Master. A book entitled Talks on At the Feet of the Master was published a few years ago, containing imperfect reports of some of these talks of his. That book will not be reprinted. The essential material in it finds its place here, carefully condensed and edited. May this book help some of our younger brothers to understand more of these priceless teachings. The more they are studied and lived, the more will be found in them. Annie Bezanт. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Part 1. Chapter 1. Introduction. 1. A.B. Light on the Path is one of a number of different occult treatises which are in the care of the great teachers and are used in the instruction of disciples. It is a part of the Book of the Golden Precepts, which contains many treatises which were written in different ages of the world, but have one characteristic in common, that they contain occult truth, and have therefore to be studied in a different way from ordinary books. The understanding of these treatises depends upon the capacity of the reader, and when any one of them is published to the world only distorted views of its teaching will be acquired, if it is taken literally. 2. Definitely intended for the quickening of the evolution of those who are on the path, this book puts forward ideals which people of the world are rarely prepared to accept. Only as far as a man is able and willing to live the teaching, will he be able to understand it. If he does not practice it, it will remain a sealed book to him. Any effort to live it will throw light upon it. But if the reader makes no effort, he will not only gain very little, but he will turn against the book and say that it is useless. 3. This treatise falls naturally into certain divisions. It was given to the Western world by the Master Hilarion, one of the great teachers belonging to the White Lodge, a master who played a great part in the Gnostic and Neoplatonic movements. One of the great persons who made attempts to keep Christianity alive. His incarnations have run very much in Greece and Rome, and he takes special interest in guiding the evolution of the Western world. He obtained the book as we have it, without the notes, from the Venetian master, one of the greater teachers whom P.B. spoke of as Chohans. 4. 15 of the short rules that you find in the first part of this book, and 15 in the second part, are exceedingly old, and were written in the most ancient Sanskrit. To these short sentences which are used as a basis for the instruction of the disciple, the Chohan added other sentences, which now form part of the book, and are always to be read along with them, to supply complementary ideas without which the reader might be led astray. All the rules in both parts of the book, except the 30 short aphorisms, were written by the Chohan who gave it to the Master Hilarion. The following table shows the 15 short rules in Part 1 as they existed in the exceedingly ancient manuscript. The number at the beginning of each is the original one, but the number at the end is that which appears in the modern book. 3i. Kill out ambition, kill out desire of life, kill out desire of comfort. 123. IVVVI. Kill out all sense of separateness, kill out desire of sensation, kill out the hunger for growth. 567. VVVith. Desire only that which is within you, desire only that which is beyond you, desire only that which is unattainable. 91,011. Exixii. Desire power ardently, desire peace fervently, desire possessions above all. 131,415. Xiexivx. Seek out the way, seek the way by retreating within, seek the way by advancing boldly without. 171,819. 5. It will be noticed from the above table, which covers only part 1 of the book, that rules 4, 8, 12, 16, 20 and 21 are absent from the list. That is because they do not belong to the most ancient part of the book. Those rules and the preliminary and concluding comments are the portion added by the greater one who gave it to the master. In addition there are notes, which were written by the master Hilarion himself. The book as originally published in 1885 contained these 3 portions, the aphorisms from the ancient manuscript, the additions of the Chohan, and the notes of the master Hilarion. All these were written down by Mabel Collins, who acted as the physical instrument, as the pen that wrote it. The master was himself the translator of the book, and he impressed it upon her brain. His was the hand that held the pen. Then there subsequently appeared in Lucifer under the title of Comments a few articles which were written by Mabel Collins under the influence of the master, and which are exceedingly valuable, worth reading and studying. 6. Now, taking up the book itself, we first find the following statement. 7. These rules are written for all disciples, attend you to them. 8. A distinction is made here between the world and the disciples. This is not a book intended for the world in general. The word disciple is to be considered in 2 senses, the uninitiated and the initiated. In reading the book carefully we can trace the 2 distinct lines of teaching clothed in the same words. Each sentence contains a double meaning, one intended for the more and the other for the less advanced. We will try to trace them out when we come to the preliminary statements. The second part of the treatise appears to be intended entirely for the initiated disciple, but this duality runs through the first part. 9. Many persons not yet approaching discipleship entirely misunderstand these rules, and often criticize them as holding up an ideal which is hard and wanting in sympathy. This is constantly the case when an ideal is presented which is too high for the reader. No person is helped by an ideal, however noble in itself, which to him is not attractive. It is a practical lesson for dealing with human beings that we should put before them only such ideals as may attract them. With all books of this kind, that which a man gets out of them is what he brings to them. His understanding depends upon his own power to answer to the thoughts which they contain. Even material things exist for us only if we have developed the organs which can respond to them. Hence at the present time there are hundreds of vibrations playing upon us to which we are incapable of giving heed. Sir William Crookes once illustrated this very well when he was trying to show how circumscribed was our knowledge of electricity, and how great therefore was the possibility of progress in electrical science. He said that it would make an enormous difference to us, would in fact revolutionize our ideas, if we had organs answering to electrical vibrations instead of eyes sensitive to light vibrations. In dry air we should not be conscious of anything, for it does not conduct electricity. A house made of glass would be opaque, but an ordinary house would be transparent. A silver wire would look like a hole or tunnel in the air. What we know of the world thus depends upon our response to its vibrations. Similarly, if we cannot answer to a truth, it is not truth for us. So, when dealing with books written by occultists we can only catch their thought in proportion to our own spiritual advancement. Any part of their thought which is too subtle or too high simply passes by us as if it were not there. 10. Much more can be got out of this book by meditation than by mere reading. Its greatest value is that it gives directions to our meditation. Pick out a single sentence and then meditate upon it. Stop the working of the lower mind and awaken the inner consciousness which comes directly in contact with the thought. One may thus get away from images of the concrete mind to a direct perception of the truth. Meditation thus enables one to obtain in the brain a large amount of the direct knowledge of the truth which the ego has acquired in his own worlds. Still, a man who meditates, but does not read or listen to a teacher as well, although he is sure to progress on the spiritual plane, will do so only slowly. If he had had the additional advantage of reading or listening, he would advance far more rapidly. The lecture or study can tune the brain of the student so that it will obtain more knowledge through meditation. But for a man who only listens or reads, and does not meditate, hardly any advancement is possible, and progress is exceedingly slow. Both should be combined. Much meditation and a little hearing or reading will carry a man far indeed. 11. CWL. On the title page of the first edition of Light on the Path, published in 1885, it is described as a treatise written for the personal use of those who are ignorant of the Eastern wisdom, and who desire to enter within its influence. But the book itself begins with the statement that these rules are written for all disciples. The latter description is surely the more accurate one, as the history of the book will show. 12. As we have it at present, it was dictated by the Master Hilarion through Mabel Collins, a lady well known in theosophical circles, who at one time collaborated with Madame Blavatsky in the editorship of Lucifer. The Master Hilarion had in turn received it from his own teacher, the great one who among theosophical students is sometimes called the Venetian. But even he was the author of only a part of it. It has passed through 3 phases. Let us set them down in order. 13. It is but a small book even now, but the first form in which we have seen it is smaller yet. It is a palm-leaf manuscript, old beyond computation. So old that even before the time of Christ men had already forgotten its date and the name of its writer, and regarded its origin as lost in the mists of prehistoric antiquity. It consists of 10 leaves, and on each leaf are written 3 lines only, for in a palm-leaf manuscript the lines run along the page, not across it as with us. Each line is complete in itself, a short aphorism, and the language in which they are written is an archaic form of Sanskrit. 14. The Venetian master translated these aphorisms from Sanskrit into Greek, for the use of his Alexandrian pupils, of whom the Master Hilarion was one, in his incarnation as Iamblichus. Not only did he translate the aphorisms, but he added to them certain explanations, which we shall do well to take along with the original. For example, if we look at the first 3 aphorisms, we shall see that the paragraph marked 4, which follows them, is clearly intended as a commentary on them, so we should read it thus: kill out ambition, but work as those work who are ambitious. Kill out desire of life, but respect life as those do who desire it. Kill out desire of comfort, but be happy as those are who live for happiness. 15. In the same way rules 5, 6 and 7 form a group, followed by 8, which is a comment by the Chohan, and so on far into the book. These groups of 3 are not put so by mere coincidence, but intentionally. If we examine them we shall find that there is a certain bond between the 3 in each case. For example, the 3 rules grouped together above point to purity of heart and steadiness of spirit. One may say that they indicate what the man must do with himself, what is his duty to himself in the way of preparation for work. 16. The second set of 3 aphorisms, numbers 5 to 8, states that we are to kill out all sense of separateness, desire for sensation, and the hunger for growth. They indicate man's duty to those around him socially. He must realize that he is one with others. He must be willing to give up selfish and separate pleasures. He must kill out the desire for personal growth, and work for the growth of the whole. 17. In the next set of 3, numbers 9 to 12, we are told what to desire, that which is within us, that which is beyond us, and that which is unattainable. These are clearly a man's duty to his higher self. Then follow aphorisms, 13 to 16, on the desire for power, peace and possessions. Those are all desires which fit us for the work of the path. The next group of rules, 17 to 20, tell the aspirant how to seek the way. 18. The rules now numbered 4, 8, 12, etc., are explanations and amplifications by the Venetian master. They, with the original aphorisms, formed the book as it was first published in 1885, for the master Hilarion translated it from Greek into English and gave it in that form. Almost immediately after it was printed, he added to it a number of most valuable notes of his own. For that first edition those notes were printed on separate pages, the backs of which were gummed so that they might be attached at the beginning and the end of the little book which bad just passed through the press. In further editions, those notes have been inserted in their appropriate places. 19. The beautiful little essay on karma which appears at the end of the book is also from the hand of the Venetian master, and was included in the book from the first edition. 20. The archaic Sanskrit manuscript which was the basis of Light on the Path was also translated into Egyptian, and many of the explanations of the Venetian master have more the ring of Egyptian than of Indian teaching. Therefore, the student who can enter to some extent into the spirit of that old civilization will find it a great help to his understanding of this book. The conditions which surrounded us in ancient Egypt were radically different from those of the present day. It is almost impossible to make people understand them now. Yet if we could get back into the mental attitude of those ancient times we should realize a very great deal which now, I am afraid, we miss. We are in the habit of thinking too much of the intellect of the present day, and are fond of boasting of the advance we have made beyond the old civilizations. There undoubtedly are certain points in which we have advanced beyond them, but there are other matters in which we are by no means at their level. The comparison is perhaps a little unfair, however, because as yet ours is a very young civilization. If we go back 300 years in the history of Europe, and especially the history of England, we find a state of affairs which seems very uncivilized indeed. When we compare these 300 years, including the 150 years of scientific development which have played so large a part in our civilized history, with the 4,000 years through which the Egyptian civilization flourished practically unchanged, we see at once that ours is a very small affair. Any civilization which has lasted as long as 4,000 years has had an opportunity to try all sorts of experiments and to obtain results which we have not had yet. So it is not fair to compare us at our beginning with any of the great civilizations at their zenith. 21. Our fifth subrace has by no means reached its highest point or its greatest glory, and that point when reached will be a definite advance upon all other civilizations, especially in certain respects. It will have its own characteristics and some of them may seem to us less pleasing than those of the earlier civilizations, but on the whole it will be an advance, because the successive races are like the tide when the waves are coming in. Each comes in and recedes, and the next one comes in just a little further. They all have their rise and climax, and their decay. With us the tide is still rising, so we have not yet the settled order in certain respects that they had in some of the older civilizations. We are, unfortunately, far as yet from the realization of unselfishness, from the feeling that the community as a whole is the chief thing to be considered and not the individual. That was attained in some of the older civilizations to an extent which would make it seem to us now a kind of utopia, but on the other hand we are growing into possession of powers which those older peoples did not possess. There was a short period in the early history of Rome when none was for the party and all were for the state, as Macaulay put it. Pythagoras, speaking to the people at Taormina, told them that the state was more than father and mother, more even than wife and child, and that every man should always be ready to give up his own thoughts, feeling and wishes for the sake of unity, for the residential publica, the original of republic, the commonweal or well-being of the whole, to which every one should be willing to sacrifice his personal interests. In England, too, in the days of Queen Elizabeth, there was a period of such true patriotic feeling and activity. 22. I do not mean that in ancient Egypt or in ancient Greece, or anywhere else in the world, all the people were unselfish. Not by any means, but all educated people took a very much wider view, a much more communal view of life than we do. They thought very much more of the state and much less of their individual welfare or progress. We shall attain to that too, and when we do we ought to realize it more fully than any of the ancient races, and also bring to it some development which the older races had not. 23. If, then, we could get back into that old Egyptian outlook, we should understand light on the path very much better. The student will do well to try to produce that attitude in himself in his study of it, so that it may help him to put himself into the place of those who studied it in the older times. 24. It is easy for some of us who have undergone the training that enables us to remember our past lives. I remember my own last incarnation in Greece, where I took part in the Eleusinian mysteries, and another life much earlier in which the great mysteries of Egypt, of which some remnants still exist in Freemasonry, figured largely. And that enables me to get more good out of such books as this than I could without such memory. Even impressions from the past, giving a sense of atmosphere, are a great help. Egyptian or Indian, there is no more precious gem in our theosophical literature, no book which will better repay the most careful and detailed study. 25. As already explained, Light on the Path was the first of 3 treatises which occupy an unique position in our theosophical literature, as they give directions from those who have trodden the path to those who desire to tread it. I remember that the late Swami T. Subbarao once told us that its precepts had several layers of meaning, that they could be taken over and over again as directions for different stages. First, they are useful for the aspirants, those who are treading the probationary path. Then they begin all over again at a higher level for him who has entered upon the path proper through the portal of the first of the great initiations. And yet again, when adeptship has been attained, it is said that once more, in some still higher sense, these same precepts may be taken as directions for one who presses onwards to still higher achievements. In this way, for the man who can understand it in the whole of its mystic meaning, this manual carries us farther than any other. These books which are definitely written for the quickening of the evolution of those who are on the path put forward ideals which men in the world are usually not prepared to accept. Even among students there may be some who wonder at the form in which the teaching is given. The only way to understand it is to take it for granted and try to live it. In At the Feet of the Master it is said that it is not enough to say that it is poetic and beautiful, a man who wishes to succeed must do exactly what the Master says, attending to every word and taking every hint. That is equally true of this book. The man who does not try to live according to the teaching will constantly come up against points in it which will ruffle him, with which he will find himself quite out of agreement. But if he tries to live it, the sense in which it is to be taken will eventually dawn upon him. Any honest effort really to live the teaching always throws light on it, and that is the only way in which this priceless pearl can be appreciated. 26. In such books there is a great deal more meaning than the actual words convey. Therefore to a large extent each man gets out of them what he brings to them. He brings the power to assimilate a certain part of their message and obtains only that part. Merely to read these books, even to study them, is therefore not enough. It is necessary to meditate over them as well. If one takes the passages that sound a little difficult, the cryptic, mystical, paradoxical statements, and thinks and meditates over them, one gets a great deal more out of them, although often one can hardly express it. 27. I try to express what occurs to me with regard to these different points, what they have meant to me, but I am conscious all the time that I am not at all fully conveying my meaning. I know, very often, I cannot express the whole idea that is in my mind. When I put it into words it sounds quite commonplace, and yet I can see for myself a vast amount of higher meaning. I see that perhaps with my mental body. The same thing is true at each level. In addition to what we can realize with the mental body, there is still more that can be realized only with the causal body and through intuition whatever we express. There will always be something deeper still budding and coming to flower within us. That man is only an expression of the eternal, and that nothing that is out of the eternal can aid us, is true, and it is the truth upon which the 3 writers of this book constantly insist. Chapter 2. The 4 Preliminary Statements. 28. Before the eyes can see they must be incapable of tears. 29. A.B. This is the first of 4 statements which describe the 4 qualifications preliminary to the path proper. They describe true sight, true hearing, true speech and true standing in the presence of the Master, that is to say, true ability to serve mankind under his direction. 30. This and the following 3 statements are intended for 2 classes of disciples. In the first class are those who are on the probationary path, and are therefore being taught to get rid of all that we speak of as the personality. These preliminary instructions are intended to show them that they must begin by eliminating the lower self. In the second class are those who are already initiated. Something more is demanded from them. They must get rid of their individuality, the reincarnating ego, so that at the end of the path their life will be entirely under the direction of the monad. We shall see therefore that each of these 4 statements can be taken as affecting the personality or the individuality. And according to the position of the student who is trying to live out their teaching will be the point of view from which he will understand them. 31. It is worthwhile to notice and remember that these statements can be taken from 2 quite different points of view in another way also. These teachings come from masters of the White Lodge, but exactly the same statements are made by those who follow the black magic of the dark side of life, whom we sometimes speak of as the brothers of the shadow or of darkness. There are 2 ways in which the eyes may become incapable of tears, and according to his motive will be the path along which the aspirant will go. One way is that of the man who aspires to become a disciple of the dark side. He will take this statement as teaching complete indifference to pleasure and pain by means of hardening the heart and avoiding all sympathy. Anyone who tries to become incapable of tears by killing out all feeling will be going towards the dark path. The man on the other way is becoming incapable of tears only as far as his own personal sorrows are concerned. His own lower nature does not move him, but he is fully awake to the feelings of others. Only at his peril can a man become indifferent to the sufferings of others. 32. We may contrast the 2 ways in a table. Dark path. White path. 1. Shuts out all feeling of sorrow. Increases the power of feeling until it responds to every vibration of others. 2. Puts up a wall round oneself. To shut out all sorrows. Throws down every wall or barrier that separates and prevents one from feeling the sorrows of others. 3. Fundamentally contracts the life. Expands the life, as one tries to pour oneself into the lives of others. 4. Leads to death, and destruction. And avicii. Leads to life, immortality, and nirvana. 33. The fundamental difference between the 2 ways is that the first tends toward separateness all the time, and ends up in a condition of absolute isolation, while the second aims constantly at union, and ends in a state of perfect unity. 34. The aspirant on the white path has gradually to eliminate everything in himself which can receive from the outer world anything which he feels as pain affecting himself, anything which shakes him through his personality. Any sorrow or trouble of any kind which works upon him as concerning his personal self. He must reach a point where he is incapable of feeling sorrows for his own separate interest. In fact, he is to aim at making his kamic sheath entirely a vehicle of the higher self, with no independent life of its own. It is to have neither attractions nor repulsions, neither desires or wishes, neither hopes nor fears, the whole of that is to be eliminated. This should not convey the mistaken idea that the sheath is to be destroyed. But it must cease to respond on its own account to impressions from the outer world. Only the separated life must be killed out, but the sheath must be kept for use in the service of humanity. 35. This change that the disciple must make in his own character is definitely shown in the constitution of the sheath. In the ordinary disciple it is constantly changing its colors. But when it is purified and all the separate life is purged away it remains a colorless and radiant vehicle, only affected by the reflections that come from the inner life. It has then no color of its own, but only that which is thrown upon it from the higher self. It resembles the appearance of the moon on water, a pearly radiance, in which there is a certain play which can hardly be called color. This change takes place very gradually in the astral body of the disciple while he is working at the difficult task of making himself responsive to all the sorrows of his fellowmen, but more and more indifferent to all which affects himself. It would be very easy for him to kill out every feeling, but to become increasingly sensitive to the feelings of others and at the same time not to permit any personal feelings to come in, is the much more difficult task set before the aspirant. As he goes on with the work, however, he will find that his selfish emotions quietly disappear as they become converted into unselfish emotions. 36. The disciple may test the quality and genuineness of his sympathy by looking to see whether or not he feels it when the suffering of others is not intruded upon his notice. If you see a person suffering, or if you come across a case of gross ill usage, no doubt you feel pain, but do you feel the same pain when the person is not before your sight? Our sympathy is an exceedingly poor thing if it is excited only by the sight of suffering. Send a person out into a great city like London, and he may be terribly affected by the suffering that he sees around him. But take him away from it all and he will soon forget the miseries he has witnessed and will become perfectly happy. The disciple has to learn to live as if the whole of that suffering were present before him all the time. To relieve it must be the motive of his work. 37. No one has reached the stage where he is responsive to the great cry of pain, spoken of in the voice of the silence, 1 Anti, page 424. Unless his motive in life is to help humanity whether the suffering be before his eyes or not, for that is the real motive power of a disciple. The best way to get rid of personality, to grow indifferent to one's own personal joys and sorrows, to become incapable of tears, is to let the mind think upon the sorrow of the world and the ways of helping it. That causes the personal self to be seen in its true place beside the larger self of the great orphan humanity. 38. When the disciple passes through initiation and begins to develop the Buddhic consciousness, this incapacity for tears takes on a new character. He then begins to understand the word evolution, to realize that in man it means the unfoldment of the higher triad. Then he begins to see the real use and object of all the suffering and pain. He gradually becomes incapable of tears because he understands the value of the suffering to those who are undergoing it, because he sees that when pain comes to a man it does so as an absolute necessity for the higher development of his soul. It is true that theoretically the man might have avoided that suffering if he had acted wisely in the past, for it is the result of his past karma when it is not produced by his present follies. But the practical aspect of the matter is that the man has been foolish, has elected to learn through this kind of experience instead of through wisdom, because he has not always chosen to follow the best he knew, and now he is suffering. And the pain is bringing him wisdom for the future, and is thereby promoting his evolution. 39. Realizing this, the disciple reaches a condition in which he may be described as full of the most perfect sympathy but without regret. The sense of regret comes in only when the consciousness is unillumined by the Buddhic life. When the Buddhic consciousness is felt, the disciple's sympathy increases enormously, but his regret disappears, and as he rises higher this wider view makes him incapable of tears. Because in the face of the bitterest suffering to which he is learning to respond and to feel in himself, he feels also its object and end. He can share in the suffering to the full, but without the slightest wish that it should be anything other than it is. The absence of any wish to get rid of the suffering before it has done its work, can only exist when the consciousness has Buddhic illumination. That is the condition which has been described as the Christ state. The law is good and the will of the Supreme is perfect, and the suffering works for a perfect end, therefore the disciple is filled with content and satisfaction, he feels the suffering, but of grief and sorrow he feels none at all. 40. When the disciple reaches this stage his consciousness has become part of the life of the world. If he thinks of himself as I, it is as part of that I, in which all other is also exist. Now there is for him nothing which is outside or separate from himself, he identifies himself with the one great life in whatever stage it may be, whenever it is in need of help. He entirely loses the sense, which is so common in the world, of some people being outside, he is in all and with all. 41. This realization of union makes an enormous difference to the help that the man is able to give to the world. When he is helping any person he feels his troubles as his own, not as the difficulties of another, separate from himself. He sees them exactly as that person does, therefore instead of assisting him from the outside he is helping him from within. There is a world of difference between the help given by one from the outside and that which is given from within, the former is a temporary and adventitious aid, but the inside help adds to the power of the man's life. 42. The disciple can reach this state only because he has cultivated sympathy, has learned to identify himself with the joys and sorrows of others, has made his own life a life common to all. Without that, this loss of separateness would be unattainable. The only incapability of tears that he has to know is that which makes him indifferent to the things that touch the personal self, but leaves him keenly alive to all that affects the other souls around him. 43. CWL. Our President has explained with regard to the first 4 statements in this book, beginning, before the eyes can see they must be incapable of tears, that they may be taken in quite a wrong way, and are then as acceptable to the black magician as to ourselves. He would understand them to mean that he must kill out all feeling, build himself into a shell and shut the sorrows and the troubles of the world outside it. That is exactly the opposite of the teaching given to the pupil on the white path, who is taught to increase his power of feeling until he attains perfect sympathy with the sufferings of his fellowmen. 44. We hear a good deal about the black magicians, but I fancy that few people know much about them. I have met many specimens of the genus, and can therefore claim to know something of their nature and methods. Some of them are very interesting people, but by no means desirable acquaintances. There are many different types who are classed under the general title of black magician. For instance, the Negroes in South Africa and in the West Indies, and probably the Aborigines of Australia, practice a good deal of petty black magic. It is a very poor thing, even they themselves admit that it does not work on white people. One has heard of certain cases in which they have succeeded in making white people exceedingly uncomfortable, but one must add that it was made possible by the kind of life those people led. Such magic depends for its success largely upon the fear of the people upon whom the incantations are laid, yet it is a real enough thing in its feeble way. These primitive people have certain drugs, they know how to hypnotize, and they have power over some low-class earth spirits and similar entities. They contrive to cause sickness to a man, or in his family, or among his flocks and herds, or to blast his gardens and fields so that they will not bear crops. Though in the latter case they are not above aiding their magic sometimes by saltpetre as well. 45. There is another set of people, somewhat more dignified, who are pursuing occult power for their own ends. They have learned a certain amount of occultism, sometimes quite a good deal, but they are using their power selfishly. They often contrive to gain money and position by such means, and to maintain themselves in that position until they die. After their death they sometimes make an attempt to carry on the same general line, but it meets with indifferent success, and their plans break down, everything sooner or later fails them and they fall back into a condition of considerable misery. 1 Anti, page 501. A life such as that means quite a definite step back for the ego. 46. Yet another and more advanced type of black magician does not desire anything for himself. He does not seek to obtain money or power or influence or anything of that sort, and that at once makes him very much more powerful. He leads a pure and self-controlled life, just as some of our own people might do, but he has set before himself the goal of separateness. He wants to keep himself alive on higher planes, free from absorption into the logos. He looks with horror upon that which for us is the greatest felicity. He wishes to maintain his own position exactly as it is, and furthermore he claims that he can do it, that the human will is strong enough to withstand the cosmic will up to a certain point. I have met men like that, and our President, who is always trying to save even the most unlikely souls, has set herself once or twice to convert people who have got themselves into that condition, so as to bring them round to our way of thinking, though not with very much success, I am afraid. She sometimes says to them, "You know what the end will be. You know quite enough of the laws of nature, and you are sufficiently intelligent to see whither your path is leading you. It is quite certain that in the end you must collapse. When this Manvantara ends, when this planetary chain is over you will be absorbed, whether you will or not, into the logos at higher levels, and what will be your condition then?" 47. You do not actually know that, they reply, yet we admit that that appears to be what will happen. But we tell you frankly that we do not care. We are well satisfied with our present position. We are able to maintain our individuality against any effort to draw us into the logos for a very long time, even till the end of the Manvantara. Whether we can hold it after that we do not know, and we do not care. Whether we can or not, we shall have had our day. 48. That is an arguable position, and the man who adopts it may be not exactly a good man, but he need not be a bad man, in the ordinary sense of the word. He certainly has a great deal of satanic pride in his composition, but he is not necessarily spiteful nor evil-minded with regard to other people. Still he is absolutely unscrupulous. Anyone who happened to get in his way he would brush aside with far less consideration than we should give to a mosquito. But to a man who did not stand in his way he might be quite a good friend, and there is not necessarily any active evil in his composition. He is not at all a monster of evil, but he is a man who has struck out a line for himself, and is following it at the cost of all that to us means progress. That is all we have a right to say against him. We are confident that he will end in great disaster, he is not so sure of that, and in any case he is willing to face it. 49. As a rule these people are sufficient unto themselves, and they distrust and despise everybody else. That is always characteristic of anyone who is on the dark path. He is right and everybody else is wrong. He looks down on everybody else. People talk sometimes about a black brotherhood. There is no such thing. There could not be any true brotherhood among them, but they do occasionally join together in face of an imminent peril or when something threatens any of their plans. At best it is a very loose alliance, formidable only because of the tremendous power that some of them possess. It does happen now and again that the work that some of our masters are doing for the evolution of the world crosses their tracks, and then they become formidable enemies. They cannot touch our masters, I think that must be very irritating to them, but they sometimes get hold of one of their pupils, and so cause them a little trouble or some disappointment, if we can suppose that a master would feel disappointment. 50. The reason of all the warnings given to us to beware of these people is that we shall find them trying sometimes to mislead us. Madame Blavatsky, who knew a great deal about them and had a wholesome respect for them, rather gave the impression that they were tempting demons who exult in evil for its own sake. This would be true only of those at a lower level. The more powerful of them would consider it quite undignified to exult in anything, but their plans, which are always entirely selfish, may sometimes involve a great deal of harm to certain people. They are as calm and self-contained and as passionless as any disciple of the master, in fact, they are more so, because they have killed out all feeling intentionally. They would not injure a man merely for the sake of doing harm, but, as I said before, in pursuit of some end of their own which his existence interferes with they would not hesitate to sweep him out of their way. Those whose work it is to assist people astrally sometimes come across their victims, and in that case the man who tries to help often brings down upon himself also the determined opposition of the black magician. 51. To return to our main topic. It is very difficult to learn to respond to feelings, and yet not permit one's personality to show itself in any way, to be in perfect sympathy with the feelings of others, and yet have none our own. Many people are very much disturbed by the sight of the suffering of others, but if they do not actually see that suffering they forget it. Many of the richer people in a city like London, for example, when taken to see the terrible misery in the slums, are very much affected, and will at once do all they can to relieve the particular cases that they see. Yet the same people will go off to their hunting and fishing and pleasure, and absolutely forget that there is any misery. In that case the sorrow is only partly for the other person's suffering. It is largely merely the personal pain of having that suffering intruded on their notice. That kind of sympathy is a poor thing, it is not real sympathy at all. 52. When we fully realize the suffering of humanity we gradually lose sight of our own. We forget that we have personal sufferings because we see that the sufferings of humanity are so great, and we realize that that which falls to our lot is after all only our part of the general burden. A man who can get into that state of mind has already very largely transcended his personality. He sorrows still for humanity, but no longer for himself, he has become incapable of tears as far as his own personal joys and sorrows are concerned. 53. It is not an easy matter to regard the sufferings of others accurately. The President and I some years ago investigated the question of the influence of pain upon different people undergoing what from the outside would be regarded as the same physical suffering. We found that in an extreme case one person was suffering perhaps 1,000 times more than another, and that in ordinary life one might quite often feel pain 100 times more than another. If one shows signs of suffering and another does not, it must not be assumed that the latter is necessarily braver or more philosophic. It may not be the case. We looked into the question of the amount of suffering which was inflicted on different people by the ignominies of prison life. To some persons they meant practically nothing, to others the most intense mental and emotional suffering. So it is futile to say, I do not feel such and such a thing, and therefore other persons ought not to feel it either. One does not know to what degree or in what proportion others are feeling. I have found that many things which do not matter in the least to me may nevertheless cause serious pain to others. Whereas it has been quite the reverse as regards other things, such as unpleasant sounds, for example, which often cause acute suffering to those who are developing their finer senses. I have seen our President in a condition of positive agony when a great ammunition wagon went clanging by the house where we were staying in Avenue Road, in London. This does not mean, of course, that she lost control of her nerves. She has often explained that while the disciple must increase his sensitiveness he must also control his nervous system, so as to bear without flinching whatever pain or disturbance may come to him. 11 Anti, pages 172, 181. 54. Before the ear can hear it must have lost its sensitiveness. 55. A.B. The disciple must become entirely indifferent to the opinions of others about himself, as far as his own feelings are concerned. If they think and speak well of him he is not to be elated, if ill, he is not to be depressed. Yet at the same time he must not be indifferent to the opinions of others as they affect the people who hold them. He is not, therefore, to be careless with regard to the impressions which he makes upon others, for if he repels them by his conduct he loses his power to help them. 56. The disciple, in the course of his progress, develops his psychic powers, and so becomes conscious of what others are thinking about him. He is then living in a world in which he may hear everything said about him, and may see every criticism in the mind of another. He reaches this point when he has risen above all criticism, and is not affected by the opinions of others. Some people are very anxious to develop clairvoyance before they have reached this stage, but if they realize this fact the astral consciousness which they so much desire would lose its attraction. 57. CWL. It must not be thought that the developed person who hears uncomplimentary remarks about himself and is profoundly indifferent to them deliberately nerves himself against the feeling of irritation, and says, that is all very dreadful. But I refuse to care. I will not pay any attention to it. He passes, no doubt through a stage like that, but very soon he reaches a state where he absolutely and utterly does not care when it is just like the twittering of birds. Or like the cicadas whistling in the trees. They may be a nuisance but that is all. He does not pick out one particular cicada and listen to its tone alone, nor does he single out the thought or the word of any one person who is saying something silly. 58. We must all try to reach that stage. We are constantly putting tea before people, because it is the attitude of our masters into whose world we are trying to go. They may very properly think, how can we hope to attain to the attitude of these great ones? Of course, no one can do it immediately, but we ought to be aiming at it and trying to get as near to it as we can, and one of the ways of doing that, a method which is really quite easy, is just not to mind in the least what other people say. 59. When we have reached that attitude the next step is to think of the bad karma these people are making in thinking or speaking wrongly about us. We may then regret it for their sake, and for that reason it is well that we should endeavor not to give more cause than we can help for foolish and depreciatory remarks, not in the least because they matter to us, but because they make bad karma for the people who indulge in them. 60. Before the voice can speak in the presence of the masters it must have lost the power to wound. 61. A.B. the disciple must lose everything in himself which can give pain to another. In the earlier stages he has to learn to eliminate from his speech all that can give pain, not merely harsh criticism or unkind language, but every form of word that hurts another by implying disparagement or drawing attention to a fault in his character. It is true that some people are in a position in which it is their duty sometimes to point out his fault to another, but it is a mistaken view that he is justified in inflicting pain while doing so. When the fault is pointed out in a perfectly friendly manner, the element of wounding is not present. Whenever the speech wounds, it is due to some imperfection in carrying out the duty. The would-be helper has failed to identify himself with the person addressed, he is giving advice only from the outside, and therefore it hurts. If he had unified himself with the other person, and tried to help at the same time feeling as he feels, he would have brought out the other person's emotion in a sympathetic way. Through the consciousness of his sympathy the other would have had his nobler and wider side awakened, and then the advice would not have been wounding. If it is your duty to criticize another and you find that it wounds him, look into yourself to find the imperfection that caused the wound. If we are to lose the power to wound, the separate individuality must go. When we feel ourselves as one life, it becomes impossible for us to inflict suffering upon anything, as it is part of ourselves. The way to reach that point of evolution is to begin by gradually purifying the speech, taking the more salient faults first. 62. CWL. Anyone who wishes to approach the Master must already have given up the desire to wound others by his speech. But there is still the possibility of wounding unintentionally and unconsciously, on account of want of sensitiveness. As we go further and raise our consciousness to a higher level, we shall more and more understand how things strike others. Those who have been practicing meditation for many years will notice that they have become more sensitive, have made a certain amount of progress towards unity. And therefore they understand the people about them just a little better than those who have not made such an effort. We hear someone make what we think an unfortunate remark, in all good faith and without noticing that there is anything wrong with it and that they have wounded somebody. We who have sharpened our senses just a little by thought and study and the endeavor to live the higher life feel instinctively how the third person will take that remark. We can see that it is an unfortunate one, and wish it had been put in some other form. 63. A master could not possibly say anything that would hurt another. He might find it necessary to give something in the nature of a rebuke. But he would manage to put it in such a way that the man would not be wounded by what he said. Sometimes a disciple finds it in the line of his duty to act sternly, and he is tempted, through his own feeling of sympathy, to avoid the task. But if the higher self asserts its dominance, he will, if it is absolutely necessary, speak sternly, but also calmly and judicially, and without indignation. 64. Before the soul can stand in the presence of the Masters, its feet must be washed in the blood of the heart. 65. A.B. This sentence has behind it a very long occult tradition, which has been given out to the world in many ways. It has to do with the teaching of sacrifice, which still appears in different religions in various forms, though they have generally lost its true meaning. The expression used here is connected with what is sometimes called the blood sacrifice and the blood covenant, of which the strangest traces are to be found among the tribes which are descended from very ancient races. 66. In looking up past lives we came across an incident which may be told to illustrate the idea behind the blood sacrifice and covenant. Very long ago he who is now the Master Morya was a great king. He had an only son who was HPB. Who as a boy was placed in charge of the captain of the guard, who was Colonel Olcott. One day, when the boy was alone with the captain, some conspirators who had plotted to slay him rushed in and would have killed him, but the captain threw himself in between and saved the boy at the cost of his own life. The youth was only stunned, but the captain lay upon him dying, and as the blood poured from his death wound he touched it with his finger and placed it on the feet of the king. The king asked, "What can I do for you who have given your life for me and my son?" The dying captain replied, "Grant that your son and I may serve you in other lives forever." Then the monarch said, "For the blood which has been shed for me and mine, the bond between us shall never be broken." In the course of time the king became a master, and the bond between them remained and ripened into that between master and disciple, and it will remain forever unbroken. In sacrificing the life of the body the captain made a tie which gave him the true life which the disciple gains from the master. 67. I mention the story because it illustrates a great truth. Just in proportion as we are strong enough to sacrifice whatever to us is the life, to pour out the life-blood of the lower at the feet of the higher, is the life really gained, not lost. All evolution of young humanity is made by the voluntary sacrifice of the lower life to the higher. When that sacrifice is completely made, it is found that life instead of being lost is made immortal. The outer sign of the sacrifice helped persons to understand the principle more readily, and drew attention to the fundamental truth that it is only when the lower life is sacrificed to the higher that it finds its own true fulfillment of evolution. On that truth the sacrifices which are found in many religions were originally based, that is how what is called the blood bond is really made. The lower life is sacrificed for the higher life, and the higher accepts the lower and lifts it up by the bond that is never broken. 68. The disciple must wash his feet in the blood of the heart. He must make a complete offering of everything, that he loves and values, of what seems to him his very life, but he loses this only to find his higher life. It is not usually an actual shedding of blood that is required, though that does become necessary sometimes. It is symbolically the shedding of blood always so far as the pupil is concerned at the time, because he feels the loss. He does literally sacrifice what to him amounts to life, and it looks as though he were giving it up completely, without any future possibility of regaining it. The great testing of the completeness of the disciple's sacrifice is made in order to discover whether the soul is strong enough to throw itself voluntarily into nothingness, to draw out the heart's blood completely, without any hope of reward. If the disciple is not strong enough to do that he is not ready to stand in the presence of the master. But if he can completely throw away everything that he knows as his life, then all the testimony of the past and the truth of the law declare that he will find that life again in a life stronger and higher than that which be laid down. It is only when that sacrifice is made that the disciple finds himself in the higher life, standing in the presence of the masters. Then the degree of his strength is the extent of his power to make the sacrifice without feeling it. 69. CWL, the meaning of this sentence is that the man who wishes to stand in the presence of the masters must have sacrificed the lower self to the higher. The feet of the soul, the personality on earth, must be washed in the heart's blood of the emotions before the higher life can be gained. 70. That is a general law of life. The little child takes great pleasure in playing with its toys. Soon it grows up into boyhood, and the lower playthings have been outgrown and put aside, in order that proficiency may be gained in the higher kind of sports. When the youth goes to college he will many a time perhaps give up a game in the fresh air, which he would very much prefer, in order to work at his books. At other times he will put aside something he would very much like to read, in order to slave at Greek verbs or other apparently uninteresting and not very useful studies. If he goes into training for a race, or for rowing, he has to sacrifice the enjoyment of good dinners, and live in a frugal and rigid way until the race is over. 71. On the occult path many pleasures connected with the outer world are seen to be a waste of time. There may be cases when it is a real effort to part with them, when there is a call from the higher life, and the aspirant responds to that call at a certain amount of cost to the lower nature. Then he must cast aside the lower in order to have the higher, but later on the attraction of the lower will have disappeared entirely. When a mart once fully realizes the higher, the lower simply ceases to exist for him, but in many cases he has to cast aside the lower before he really enters into the glory and the joy and the beauty of the spiritual life. 72. I have known many whose opportunities were good but who shrank back just at that point, and failed because they were not ready to give up all that they had previously enjoyed, and apparently received nothing in return for it. Sometimes a man is afraid to let go of one thing until he can grasp the other, and so he holds fast to the lower, but it does not satisfy him, because he has glimpsed the higher. To give up everything at the master's call, one wonders whether one could do it, one always thought and hoped that one would, but when it comes to the point, can you do it fully and cheerfully? Many have worked for years and years, and wonder why they do not attain, why they are not among those whom the master is able to draw very close to himself. The reason is always the same, it is the personality in some form that keeps them back. This giving up of everything is not a thing to be done with constant backsliding, giving up one day, and grasping and trying to keep the next, nor is it to be done with pride, with the pose, I have given up everything. That is quite the wrong attitude, it should be done as a matter of course, and cheerfully. The person who is going to succeed will feel that there is nothing else for him to do but to make the great renunciation when the moment comes. Chapter 3. The First Rule. 73. Kill out. 74. A.B. The expression, kill out, appears at the beginning of the first 6 short rules. It is important not to misunderstand it. There are 2 ways of getting rid of or killing out an evil thought, an evil habit or an evil act. Let us consider the thought first, because when that has been removed the other 2 very easily follow. Suppose an evil thought comes into a man's mind. He finds that it tends to repeat itself. Then his first inclination is generally to fight with it, to throw his energy against it and violently turn it out, just as he would deal with a physical enemy. He wants to get it out of the mind, so he takes it by the shoulders and flings it out. 75. That is not the best way. It ignores the great law which works throughout nature, that action and reaction are equal and opposite. Take a ball and throw it against a wall, it will rebound and strike you, gently if you have thrown it gently, but with great force if you have flung it violently. The same principle is true everywhere. Suppose you turn a thought out of the mind with violence, there will be a decided reaction. The recoil will give you a definite sense of exhaustion, and the thought may come back to you with increased force. The strength that you have put out has then taken form as thought, and has come back to you again, and you have to repeat the struggle. In that way a man may in some cases fight for weeks and months and even years, and yet be none the better for it. Still, in time it is possible to kill out evil thought by this means, though with it you will also kill out a large amount of your own force and energy, of your thought power. So that a certain hardness and lack of responsiveness of some area of the mental body will be the result of the struggle. 76. The other way of killing it out is to substitute for the bad thought a good thought of exactly opposite nature. You first deliberately study the matter and decide what is the opposite, the exact antithesis, of the evil thought. You formulate the new thought quietly in your mind, and then, at the very moment when the evil thought comes into your mind, you substitute for it the opposite good thought. Thus for pride you might substitute kindness, for anger affection, for fear admiration, and for low material desires thoughts of purity, dignity, honor, and the like. Or you might dwell with devotional thought upon the mental image of the Master as having the good quality, and forget yourself in thinking of him. 77. The human mind cannot concentrate on 2 separate things at once. So when you give your attention to the good thought the result is that the evil thought is expelled without your directing any force towards it. Thus no mental energy is wasted, no vitality is lost. The good thought soon gains strength, and the mind becomes impervious to the attacks of the bad thought, and irresponsive to its kind, so you have practically killed out the evil by intensifying and vitalizing the opposite good. It is as if we sucked the life out of the bad thought, and left it a mere shell. Bad thoughts are most effectively killed by such devitalization. 78. We have thus 2 ways of killing out. The former on the line of death, the latter on that of growth. One is the plan which is chiefly used by those who are beginning to tread the left-hand path, who are turning against the way of the divine will. The other is that of evolution in accordance with the divine plan. We are free to choose which we will follow of these 2 great roads. All the things of the world are in evolution, moving on one or the other of these paths. 79. Those parts of the world in which Ishvara is developing his image have a certain free will, which consists in their being able to work with the divine will or away from it as separate individuals. Those who work with him ultimately tread the right-hand path, but those who deliberately choose the separated self are preparing themselves to tread the left-hand path. Speaking generally, all that leads to isolation tends to turn a man's direction to the left, and all that tends to unity towards the right. People of the left-hand path kill out sympathy, affection and love, because they find that those qualities bring misery, and also stand in the way of their gaining power. The killing out process is generally taken therefore by those who want to gain power and the other things that they consider desirable in this life, for the firm establishment and the enjoyment of the separated self. Careless of the good of the whole, entirely bent upon their own individual progress and gain. They will kill violently all that side of their own nature the response to which would be an obstacle in the path of power. They will kill out affection also, because it is an avenue of pain, and it is far easier to become indifferent by killing out affection than by becoming more and more sensitive. 80. But the way we have been taught is that of union, the path in which the disciple becomes responsive to every cry of pain, as was so emphatically taught in the Voice of the Silence. 1 Anti, Volume 2, pp. 137-45, the disciple must intensify his life, not minimize it, he must submit to the law, not fight against it. Then of course the law will be with him. His method is something like that art of wrestling which is taught in Japan, in which conquest is gained by yielding to one's antagonist. The man constantly yields to his opponent, but at the critical moment he turns in such a way that the force of his antagonist tells against himself. This is the nature of the yoga of the right-hand path. Of it Sri Krishna says in the Gita, "In this there is no loss of effort, nor is there transgression." 2 Op. Cit. 11:40. 81, CWL. Many people, when they are told to kill out a desire, start making what may be described as a violent raid upon it. They want to kill out a certain evil quality, so they set themselves very strongly, angrily almost, against that quality. One result of this is that one stirs up whatever forces exist, inside and outside, which are tending in the opposite direction, into the most violent opposition possible, and the consequence is a serious struggle. If a man is sufficiently determined he will come out conqueror in the end, but in many cases he will waste a large amount of his own force and energy and thought power, and leave himself much exhausted and depleted. 82. I can testify that the method of substitution works very much better, for I have tried both. It is a sort of moral ju-jutsu whereby you employ the force of the hostile power to help you. You do not so much attack the foe as concentrate all your attention on the opposite virtue. If for example, a man is inclined to be readily upset and disturbed, he should not fight hard against that, but instead should think constantly of calmness, of peace and philosophy. Presently that thought will become established by habit, and he will find that the old worry and lack of calmness have passed away without his making a desperate fight. If he surrounds himself with thought forms such as, "do not be irritable," and so on, they are still of the color of irritability, and they react undesirably on him. But if he thinks strongly, "be calm, be gentle, be peaceful," he sets up vibrations appropriate to and productive of peace and harmony. We do not want to set one vice to fight another vice, but we want to ignore all these things and work up the opposite virtue. By doing that the effect will be just as good and we shall achieve it with far less trouble. 83. We say, kill out desire, but not, kill out emotion. The higher emotions must be encouraged always, and the stronger they are the better. Especially is this true of love and devotion, which one should deliberately cultivate. When a man feels a great rush of such an emotion as these, his aura expands, his astral body becomes perhaps 10 times its normal size in the case of the ordinary person. And much more than that when the man really knows how to use his higher vehicles. When the great paroxysm of feeling is over, the aura contracts again, but not exactly to what it was before, having been much stretched it remains at least a little larger than before. The first effect of the expansion is a rarefaction of the astral body, but it very speedily draws in more astral matter to fill the larger space, so as to make it up to about its normal density. 84, 1 See also Anti. Volume 2, pages 139-40. 85. The astral body is definitely needed in order that by means of it one may be able to sympathize with people, and also because of its function as a reflector of the Buddhic body. In the case of a developed person there is no color in his astral body except what is mirrored from the higher planes, it only reflects and shows the most delicate tints of color. 22 Anti, Volume IL, Chap, on the 4 preliminary statements. 86. There are 3 ways in which the higher self is connected with the personality. Point 3, 3 Anti. Volume 2, page 333. The higher mind is reflected in the lower. The buddhi or intuition is reflected a stage lower than the mind, in the astral body. There is also the possibility of connection between Atma and the physical brain. The last is the most difficult to understand. It shows tremendous power of will, which moves without consideration of the means by which its object is to be achieved. It is the method of the first ray, to which Dr. Bezanт belongs. She has that great power of deciding that something shall be done, without stopping to consider the methods to be employed until afterwards. We do not know the limits of the human will. It has been said that faith may remove mountains and cast them into the sea. I do not know whether there would be any particular purpose to be served in doing that, if it can be done, but I have certainly seen very wonderful results accomplished by the human will, and I do not know where the limits of that power are set. Incredible things are done, more especially on the higher planes, by the mere action of will. When I had to take up the study of materialization, for example, according to my way of progress, I had to learn exactly how it was to be done, a complicated process involving a good deal of knowledge of the different materials to be brought together and how they could best be arranged. But I have known a person, who knew nothing whatever about it, to drive straight in by the tremendous force of will and produce the same result, without gathering together all the complicated things that were necessary. And without in the least knowing how it was done. Such will is one of the divine powers latent in all of us, but in very few does it ever come to the surface and produce such a result without a long course of careful training. 87. I think that for most people the easiest of the 3 ways of making connection with the higher self is to bring together the higher and lower minds, by passing from concrete to abstract thought, or from analysis to synthesis. But I have seen cases in which a person has been able to reach the Buddhic consciousness without disturbing the relations between the mental and causal bodies at all. When it can be done, I have heard on high authority that this unification of the Buddhic and astral bodies is the shortest of all roads to the goal, but the capacity to do it is gained only as the result of much suffering in previous lives. Those for whom that is the line raise themselves by the intensity of their love of devotion into the Buddhic vehicle and effect a junction there. Before they have developed the lower mind to anything like a level where it can work in with the higher mind, and before they have developed the causal body itself. Of course these 2 bodies must be developed, they cannot be overlooked. The aspirant will work upon the lower mind from the astral body, developing it and learning whatever has to be learnt, on account of his love and devotion. The pupil loves his master so intensely that for his sake he will learn what is needed, and will thus develop whatever intellect is necessary. He also acts upon the causal body from above, and pours into it the Buddhic conception, and so forces it to express that as far as it can do so in its own way. 88. Kill out ambition. 89. AB. We now turn to the first rule, dealing with ambition in particular. The undeveloped man is strongly held by the attractions of the senses, he desires physical luxury and bodily enjoyment. He does not feel ambition, which is the desire for power, until the mind is highly developed and the intellectual power has grown strong. The note of the intellect is I. It causes the man to feel himself separate, and that invariably leads him to wish to exercise power, because that desire is the self-assertion of the individual soul. He feels himself superior to all around him, and that shows as a desire for physical authority. From that comes the temptation to seek and grasp social and political power. In the political and social sphere ambition is the great moving force. For the man who by his intellect has gained influence over his fellow men, stands out as their leader, and this is a position which is incense in the nostrils of the proud and superior man. 90. Then the man begins to despise outer power over the bodies of men, and there comes into his mind the realization of a subtler form of power, which he now seeks to obtain. He no longer wants to lay down laws with physical authority. He has the subtler longing to dominate and rule the minds of men. That is intellectual ambition, the ambition to be a leader of thought. It is not an ambition which would move anyone who had not a largely developed intellect. 91. Still later, when that desire has been outgrown, ambition reappears in a yet subtler form, when the man passes on into the spiritual life. He thinks of the spiritual progress as made by himself for his own sake, because he wants to grow and understand and progress. The old ambition is really still holding him, and it is more dangerous because it is higher and subtler. That is why in the note to this aphorism the master makes the remarkable statement that the pure artist, who works for the love of his work, is sometimes more firmly planted on the right road than the occultist who fancies he has removed his interest from self, but who has in reality only enlarged the limits of experience and desire, and transferred his interest to things which concern his larger span of life. The occultist is no longer confined to the ambitions of his present incarnation, yet his ambition may not be dead. He no longer cares to be a lawgiver or ruler of mankind, nor even an arbitrator in the thoughts of men. But he desires to be high in the spiritual world. He realizes that he is going to live life after life, and his ambition extends to the whole span of that greater life. He is still longing to be first, to be separate, to be what others are not. Yet that too must be overcome. 92. When one speaks to those who desire to be part of the universal life, the very first thing that one must tell them is to kill out that which makes for separateness. There would, however, be no gain in putting such an ideal before the ordinary man. He cannot leap at once from the worldly life into a spiritual life in which he is in full activity, but nevertheless doing nothing connected with the personal or the individual self. If you tell an ordinary man of the world to kill out ambition, and if he does it, the effect will not be a desirable one, for he will fall into lethargy and do nothing. 93. Suppose a man is further on than that, is on the probationary path, how should he read this rule about ambition? Most wisely by applying the word kill to the lower form of ambition, he should in fact understand it to mean transmute. He should get rid of ambition for the things of the world, but put before himself something higher for which he can be ambitious. That would be the desire for spiritual knowledge and growth. At this stage a man does not get rid of ambition totally. He enters an intermediate state, and will make great progress if he puts before himself as his goal the attainment of spiritual knowledge and the object of finding the master and ultimately becoming a master himself. Really these are all ambitions, but they will help him to shake off many of the lower shackles which enwrap his personality. 94. This quality of ambition which the disciple has to kill out had its uses in his earlier evolution. It was a means to make the man's individuality firm and steady. In the earlier stages he grew by his isolation. It was then requisite for the evolution of the physical and mental bodies that there should be competition and fighting. All those stages of combat and fight were necessary in order to build up the individual, to make him strong so that he could hold his own center. He had to have a place defended from outside aggression, in which he could develop his strength. He also needed such worldly position as ambition seeks, just as when you are building a house you need scaffolding. Ambition had many uses in the earlier stages, to build up the walls and make them denser, to strengthen the will, and to help to raise the man step by step. A man in whom ambition predominates also kills out sexual and other lower desires, because they hinder him in his intellectual growth and his search for power, and thus he dominates his lower passions. In the early stage man thus needs ambition as a means of growth. 95. You would not say to the man of the world, kill out ambition, because ambition stimulates him and draws out his faculties. But when as a disciple the man is to grow into the spiritual life, he must get rid of the walls that he built round himself in earlier stages. As after a house is built the scaffolding must be taken away, so the later part of the man's evolution consists in rendering the walls translucent, so that all life may pass through them. Therefore these rules are for disciples, not for the men of the world. 96. CWL. Ambition in the undeveloped man shows itself as the desire, let us say, to gain wealth so that he may satisfy his craving for physical luxury and bodily enjoyment. Later on, when he develops intellect, he becomes ambitious for power. Even when a man has transcended the ambition for power and the prizes of this world, and is working selflessly for the benefit of humanity, there still remains very often the ambition to see the result of his work. 97. Many people are devoting their time quite willingly and quite earnestly to doing good work, but they like others to know it, and to say what good and useful people they are. That also is ambition. Mild certainly as compared to some other kinds, but still it is personal, and anything that is personal stands in the way of the disciple. The lower self has to be eliminated entirely. It is hard to do it because the roots are very deep, and when they are torn out the man is left bleeding, and feeling as though all the heart were gone out of him. 98. When we have got rid of the desire to see the result of our work, we still have the desire for recognition in a higher form. We still, perhaps, are ambitious for love, we want to be popular. It is well and good for a man to be popular, to draw the love of his fellows, because that very fact is an additional power in his hands. It enables him to do more than he otherwise could, also it surrounds him with a pleasant atmosphere which makes all sorts of work easier. But to desire that in the sense of being ambitious for it is also a thing which we must avoid. We may rightly be happy if love comes our way, that is well and good, it is good karma, but if it does not, we must not be ambitious for it. We cannot seize upon a person and say, "You shall love me, you shall appreciate me." If his feelings run that way he will, if not he cannot, and to pretend would be worse than all. 99. We have to rise above all these stages of ambition which are still found in the ordinary world. We must give for the joy of giving, whether it be work, or substance, or love or devotion, whatever it is we must give freely and heartily, and never think of any return. That is the only real love, not the sort of love which is always saying, "How much does so-and-so love me?" The real attitude should be, "What can I do to pour myself out at the feet of the one whom I love? Of what service can I be? What can I do for him?" That is the only feeling that is worthy of so grand a title. All that we know perfectly well, but we must put it into practice. It seems to be difficult, sometimes, to do that, because there is still a remnant of the lower self to be removed. 100. For the ordinary man, maybe even for the one who is approaching the path, I think it would perhaps be well to qualify this rule to some extent, and say, kill out the lower ambitions. It is not advisable to set before the man, who is just beginning, a standard of conduct which he can only hope to reach after many years of effort. If a man has worldly ambitions he cannot be expected at once to drop them all and have nothing to fill their place, that would be scarcely possible for him, and it is even doubtful whether so sudden a change would be good for him. He must first transmute his ambitions. Let him, if he will, at first desire knowledge earnestly, desire to make advance in occultism and progress in unselfishness, let him desire to draw near to the Master, to be chosen as a pupil. 101. Most of us have desires of that sort, but we call them aspirations. The change of name seems to connote a total change in our attitude, but of course they are still desires. We shall reach a stage when even those desires will disappear, because we shall be absolutely certain that progress depends on our own efforts only, then we shall no longer desire anything. The Master once said, "Do not desire a thing. Desire is feeble will." 1 Volume 1, Part 5, ch. 1, Liberation, Nirvana and Moksha. Do not think of some quality you want to develop, "I should like to have it," but say, "I will have it," and go and develop it. That is the only line for a man to take, because these things are absolutely in his own hands to do or not, as he chooses. 102. It is a case of transmuting at first. The desire for spiritual growth is a thing that those who are approaching the path should no longer be encouraging in themselves, but there is that intermediate stage when it is very natural. We who are students ought to be getting to a stage at which we take our spiritual growth for granted, and fix all our energies on trying to help others. At first a man does need a personal motive. Then he gradually comes to forget himself and to make his advancement for the sake of the Master, for the sake of pleasing him, and eventually he learns that he is simply a channel for the great divine forces. And that he must be a good channel and must have no anxiety whatever about the result. His one care then is that nothing on his part shall hinder his being an expression of the divine, as perfect an expression as is possible for him. He does not worry in the least about it. He does not desire that his force may be used in this direction or that. He is simply a tool in the hands of God, that he may be used as errant how and where God wills. 103. Of course, we can attain that attitude only by degrees. But we should set it before ourselves as the state of mind at which we should aim. We must begin by forgetting ourselves, by rigorously weeding the self out. What if we are not gaining the advancement which we think to be due to us after so many years of thought and study, or what if the people whom we help are not grateful for being helped? Generally they are not. All that does not matter. 1 volume. Part 3, ch. 2, The One Good Desire. Let us forget ourselves and do the work, and let us be entirely indifferent as to any return. Karma will look after that. We need have no fear. The great laws of the universe are not going to be altered in order to do an injustice to any one of us, we may be quite sure. They will work with equal balance, justly they work, even though it be after many days. Forget yourself. That is the first and the last word of advice on the occult path. There is no other way. However hard it may seem, it has to be done, and has to be done perfectly. 104. We come now to the first note of the Master Hilarion, which is attached to the first rule. I will take it bit by bit. It begins. 105. Ambition is the first curse, the great tempter of the man who is rising above his fellows. It is the simplest form of looking for reward. 106. That is rather a curious way of putting it, but it is obviously true. The first temptation that comes to a man who knows he is rising a little above the rest in some way is to think of himself as a great man, and this leads him to resolve that he will rise still further, so that he may enjoy the pleasure of his pride even more. 107. Men of intelligence and power are led away from their higher possibilities by it continually. 108. How true that is, no one can know who is not clairvoyant. Those who are pupils of the masters necessarily, I suppose, have the habit of regarding all the people they meet more or less from the point of view of their possible discipleship. One sees a man who is in some ways obviously a good man. The first thought that comes into one's mind about him is, how near is he to the point when he can become a pupil of the master? To us it is the greatest reward, the most precious piece of advancement that can come to any man, that he should reach the stage where he is worth taking in hand by one of these great ones, so that his future evolution may be assured. Attainment is after that merely a matter of time and, of course, of perseverance and much hard work. 109. Though it is quite true that for every human being progress is merely a question of time, for many human beings it is clearly a matter of so very much time that they may be taken en bloc, so to speak, dealt with in the mass. But the moment that a man comes near to the stage when conceivably a master might take him in hand, he also becomes an object of very keen interest to the pupils of the master. And their desire is always to try to help him to the point where definite contact may become possible. It should always be remembered that it is merely a question of the man's deserts in the matter, there is no favoritism of any kind. The moment it is worth the master's while to expend as much energy as would be required to teach that man, he will do so. But it is only worth his while when he will be able to do more work through the man than he himself could do with the same energy devoted to other work. 110. We meet a large number of people who seem as though they were not far from that point. They are so good in one way or another, and some are so hopeful all round, that it seems to us that surely with a very little more of the right direction of their energies they would be fit for discipleship, and then we are disappointed to find that it all comes to nothing and they spend their lives in the ordinary way. Most especially I have noticed that with boys and girls, among whom it has always been my lot to have to look for hopeful cases. There are many young people who are quite near the point where, if their energies were just turned in the right direction, they would make very good subjects indeed for such progress, and yet they fail to grasp the opportunity. They get drawn into the competition of ordinary school life, and are swept into a world of lower thought. It is not bad thought, I do not mean that, though that may happen sometimes, but they are swept into a sort of whirlpool of comparatively worldly thought. The goal put before them is generally that of success in some material way, to become great engineers or great lawyers, or to succeed at the head of some mercantile house. 111. Not only is a worldly career expected of them by their parents, but the general trend of public opinion also influences them in that direction, and it is very hard to escape from the effect of public opinion. It is pressing upon us all the time in all directions, and so it comes about that these young people, who seem so nearly ready for the higher thing, seldom reach it. Instead they take up a very estimable and useful career, but it is just not that higher thing. I have followed up some cases that seem to me specially likely, and I have found that the same thing has sometimes occurred to egos for a number of incarnations. For a dozen or 20 incarnations they have been very nearly ready, within measurable distance of taking that great step, but each time they have turned aside from it. And practically always it has been worldly ambition that has led them away from their higher possibilities. 1 Volume 1, Part 2, ch. 3, Right and Wrong. 112. When the Master Hilarion says that men of intelligence and power are continually led away from their higher possibilities by ambition, I think he must have had cases in mind very similar to those which I have just described. Because those to whom the higher possibilities lie open must necessarily be men of intelligence and power, not mere ordinary men. He does not say that ambition ruins their lives, but only that higher possibilities exist for them from which it leads them away. It is surely not bad for a boy that he should wish to be a great engineer, a great lawyer, or a great doctor. These are all fine professions, but there are other things which are even more useful, and if he could see and choose the more useful line it would surely be better for him. We cannot say that the worldly work is bad, but only that there is better work. When one says better work one is not depreciating any of these professions or their value to the world. One means that most well-educated men with ordinary capacity could take up those duties and make more or less of a success of them. Whereas only those who have a history behind them from the occult point of view can take up with success the narrow and difficult path of occult training. Those who follow it can do more good even than the man who wins high distinction along any of those other lines, so when there is a child who wishes to take it up, who obviously would be able to do so, no one should stand in his or her way. 113. Yet it is a necessary teacher. Its results turn to dust and ashes in the mouth, like death and estrangement. It shows the man at last that to work for self is to work for disappointment. 114. The man who attains that which he has so long and so earnestly desired, often finds later that it is not quite what he hoped it would be. Men who scheme to obtain power and high position find that the power is to a great extent illusory, that it is hampered in all directions, as in the case of Lord Beaconsfield, which I mentioned before. It is possible that he might have done more good by giving all his energy to the pursuit and spread of occultism. His works are not very much read, nowadays, but his occult knowledge shows through them as, for example, in his wonderful tale of Alroyd.11 Volume 2, page 292. 115. But though this first rule seems so simple and easy, do not quickly pass it by. For these vices of the ordinary man pass through a subtle transformation and reappear with changed aspect in the heart of the disciple. 116. For the disciple there are special temptations, special difficulties. The ordinary man is proud, perhaps, of certain things he can do. The pupil of the master knows full well he must not be proud of any advancement that comes to him. Indeed, knowing the masters, he cannot well be proud, for all sense of pride falls away from any man who really knows them. He may be able to do many things that others cannot do, but yet he is constantly, by the necessity of the case, in the presence of one or of many who can do quite infinitely more than he can. And so pride, to do them justice, is not often found in the pupils of the masters. Yet the whole thing is very subtle. The pupil, if he is not careful, will find that he is proud of not being proud. Proud to find how humble he is in spite of the wonderful things he can do and think and say. Or he may try to elbow himself to the front among those who are serving the master, because in his pride he thinks that he can do the work best and that his presence at the top is essential. But Madame Blavatsky said in her first steps in occultism, no one can think, I am better or more pleasing to the master than my fellow disciples and remain a pupil of the master. N.D.R. Bezanт once said, one of the first rules for an occultist is to be as unobtrusive as possible, so that his personality will attract the smallest possible attention. 117. Those who are students of occultism, but not yet pupils, may more easily fall into the error of pride. It is a great difficulty for those who develop psychic powers. They find that they can see so much that others cannot. So much is open to them that is unknown to others, that they begin to feel themselves superior to their fellow men, and very often that leads to rather disastrous results. When we find psychics who show great pride, I think we may generally take it for granted that they are not as yet trained people, that though they are developing the higher faculties they have not yet come into contact with the master. Because the absence of pride is a sure sign of one who is learning his lesson properly. 118. It is easy to say, I will not be ambitious, it not so easy to say, when the master reads my heart he will find it clean utterly. 119. That is quite a different thing. We can so easily persuade ourselves that we are not ambitious, that we are never selfish, never irritable. We can persuade ourselves of many things, but the master sees with the all-seeing eye that discerns the facts and not the gloss and the glamour we throw over them when we look at ourselves. 120. The pure artist who works for the love of his work is sometimes more firmly planted on the right road than the occultist who fancies he has removed his interest from self. But who has in reality only enlarged the limits of experience and desire, and transferred his interest to the things which concern his larger span of life. 121. Cynical people might remark that the true artist in that sense is unknown, but that is not so. I have had a great deal to do with artistic circles both in England and in France, and though there is much jealousy and want of generous appreciation among artists in general, yet I also surely have known more than one artist who did live and work for the love of his art and not for gain. Because he so worked, he often threw away many obvious chances of worldly advancement, thinking that to take advantage of them would involve disloyalty to his art. A man who is willing to do that for the sake of his art has already made some progress on the way to getting rid of the lower self. There may be a higher form of selfish ambition at the back of it, but at least he has gone a long way in eradicating the mere lower self when he has lost the ambition for worldly wealth and success. 122. There is a stage at which the occultist has quite conquered all desires connected with the personality, has risen above all the ordinary ambitions of men, but still has ambition for his separate individuality or ego, and is thinking generally of its progress instead of the good he can do to others. So it may well be that an artist who did altogether sacrifice the thought of self, even though he knew nothing about occultism, might have his feet more firmly planted on the right road than such an occultist. 123. The same principle applies to the other two seemingly simple rules. Linger over them, and do not let yourself be easily deceived by your own heart. 124. The master here refers to rules 2 and 3, which we shall deal with in the next chapter. These tell us to kill out desire of life and of comfort. He warns us to be cautious with regard to all three, for the mind is extraordinarily, even quite diabolically, clever at making excuses for us, at finding all kinds of reasons for doing what we want to do. We may not think of ourselves as particularly clever or intellectual, but if we look back over the excuses we have invented for doing things we have wanted to do, we usually have to admit that we have shown amazing capacity in that direction. 125. For now, at the threshold, a mistake can be corrected. But carry it on with you and it will grow and come to fruition, or else you must suffer bitterly in its destruction. 126. CWL. This is the end of the Master Hilarian's long note to Rule 1. The more a man advances on the path of occult development, the deeper he will bury any fault which has not yet been eradicated. Suppose it be selfishness, the greatest and most common of all faults, because it lies at the root of so many others. He may have got rid of all its outer evidences, and may imagine himself to be entirely free from it, and yet the fault itself may still be unconquered. The further he goes on the path the more deeply it will be hidden. In the meantime he is gradually raising the strength of the vibrations of his vehicles so that all his qualities, whether bad or good, must be greatly intensified. If there is an evil quality the existence of which may be quite hidden, both from the man himself and his friends, it will be growing stronger and stronger, and inevitably sometime it must break through and show itself. Then just because he has made considerable advance it will produce a much more serious disaster than would have been the case at an earlier stage, and he certainly will suffer a good deal in its destruction. 127, AB. The man on the path must do his work thoroughly. On the threshold mistakes can easily be corrected. But unless the disciple gets rid entirely of the desire for power while he is in the early stages of his spiritual apprenticeship, it will become stronger and stronger. If he does not weed it out where it is based in the physical, astral and mental planes, but allows it to take root in the spiritual plane of the ego, he will find it very difficult to eradicate. Ambition thus established in the causal body is carried on from life to life. The physical, astral and mental bodies die, and he gets new ones, but the causal body does not die till the end of the kalpa. So let the pupil beware of permitting spiritual ambition to touch the causal body and build into it elements of separateness which more and more encase the life. 128. Work as those work who are ambitious. 129, AB. I have taken this sentence out of its place in the book, where it occurs at the beginning of Rule 4, and brought it in for consideration here, where it specially applies. It is the comment of the Chohan upon Rule 1. In each case we will take the rule and then the comment that the Chohan gave in explanation of it. Put them together, and you get the sense. Thus you read, 1. Kill out ambition, but work as those work who are ambitious. 2. Kill out desire of life, but respect life as those who desire it. 3. Kill out desire of comfort, but be happy as those who live for happiness. 130. Desire for power, life and happiness forms the motive power of the world. These are the prizes that Ishvara holds out before all beings, and the result is that evolution goes on. All the struggles that a man makes for these things bring out his qualities and cause him to evolve. Suppose the whole of this is suddenly removed, a man loses all ambition, all desire for life and for happiness. That represents a stage through which men pass before the longing for the spiritual life awakens fully in them. It is called Vairagya, and is the result of Satiety. 1, Volume 1, Part 1, ch. 7, the four qualifications. Part 3, ch. 1, the removal of desire. Volume 2, pages 56, 264-5, 314, 324. The man has enjoyed power and has found that it does not bring happiness. He has worked for it and grasped it, but has found that the effect of it on the inner ego is only disappointment. It is not what he expected, and it does not bring satisfaction. Take the case, for example, of the late Emperor of Russia, who stood at the summit of human power, was thoroughly tired of it, and heartily wished himself free of it. It is not an uncommon thing in history that a man who wields absolute power gets a fit of Vairagya and abdicates his position. 131. The result of that is a collapse, a lessening of all the motives that had animated him up to that point. Then the man droops down, and says, "Why should I exert myself any more? I do not want power, why then should I work? I do not want life, why then should I continue to live? I do not want comfort, it gives me no satisfaction. Why then should I do anything to gain it?" 132. The question for us is, how may such a man be stimulated into renewed activity so that he may continue to grow and may finish his evolution? How may he be aroused from his state of collapse? Only by attracting into activity the divine life in him, that lives by giving, not by taking. He is now at the critical point in his career. If he is still to cling to the separated self, his future lives will be full of weariness and disgust. Is it possible to awaken in him the desire of the true life, which consists in pouring oneself out in service, not in indrawing into selfish idleness? 133. In his present state the man is a worthless creature in the world, useless to himself and everybody else. Before he reached this condition he was a force that helped the general evolution of the world, because he was affected by those things which attract normal men and enable them to evolve. Into this condition of perfect collapse and uselessness into which he has been plunged by the loss of ordinary lower motives, there comes a special appeal, an appeal which meets him on the 3 points where he had lost his motive. 134. It is to the man in this condition that the command comes, work as those work who are ambitious. That is joined to the first teaching, kill out ambition, that taken alone would lead to lethargy. The separated self being killed, the man has now no motive for work, so the cry comes, work as those work who are ambitious. Then comes the second command, respect life as those do who desire it, and the third, be happy as those who live for happiness. These are the 3 new commands that are to begin the new life, the 3 new motives that replace the 3 old ones. The man is lying there as dead. The life of the form is dead. Now he has to waken up the life of the consciousness. That will be done by these 3 appeals. He has to begin to work again, but now it must be the spiritual man who lives and works, while the personality acts like a machine. He has to live more than ever he did before, though the desires for life, happiness and power have all been extinguished. This is the answer to his question, why should I work? 135. If a man does not find the answer, he will remain in the dead condition and will grow no further. It is the point known to students of mechanics as a dead point, the point of equilibrium, in which there is no force to push him on. The higher forces have counterbalanced the lower ones and destroyed his former selfishness and ambition, but are not yet strong enough in him to send him forth full of energy and purpose in their cause. That equilibrium is not the object of evolution. What new motives can be put before the man so as to arouse him from this state and make him active? There is only one which can stir the soul from within, his identifying himself with the life of Ishvara in the world, and acting as a part of that life instead of with the desire for the fruit of action. 136. There is no better commentary on this sentence than that which you will find in the 3rd discourse of the Bhagavad Gita, where reasons are given why a man should work after he has lost the common motives. The desire for the fruits of action. 137. But the man who rejoiceth in the self, with the self is satisfied, and is content in the self, for him verily there is nothing to do. 138. For him there is no interest in things done in this world, nor any in things not done, nor doth any object of his depend on any being. 139. Therefore, without attachment, constantly perform action which is duty, for, by performing action without attachment, man verily reacheth the supreme. 140. Janaka and others indeed attain to perfection by action, then having an eye to the welfare of the world also, thou shouldst perform action. 11 Op. Cit. 3, 17-20. 141. That which is described here is a still higher stage than that of the man of whom we are now thinking. We have been considering only the beginning of that path which leads to this full realization of the self. But the motive which is given here applies to him. He has realized the emptiness of the non-self, and is in a position to respond to the appeal of the one self. He is prepared to work with the motive of benefit to the world. Such a man may now think of trying to gain spiritual knowledge not in order that he himself may thereby become wise and great, but because it will help the world. He is gradually making that his object, something outside his own individual self. 142. Finally he will drop that motive of lofty desire also, and only wish that he may be an organ of the higher, and may do that which Ishvara wishes. Then he will learn that he is not even to desire spiritual knowledge, nor even to become a master, but simply to become an instrument for the higher life. Thus being active as they who are ambitious, but with the motive of being a channel for the higher life, the man will get rid of the last vestiges of ambition. His energy is now merged in the will of the Logos. That becomes the motive for his working. 143. In the verses of the Gita quoted above, Sri Krishna explains how a man should work in order to reach the Supreme, to realize the presence and power of the Divine. Then he goes on to show that such attainment and realization lead to fuller activity than any ever known before. He explains that it is the active work of Ishvara that sustains everything. 144. There is nothing in the three worlds, O Partha, that should be done by me, nor anything unattained that might be attained, yet I mingle in action. 145. For if I mingled not ever in action unwearied, men all around would follow my path, O son of Pritha. 146. These worlds would fall into ruin, if I did not perform action. 11 Ibid, 3, 22-24. 147. He works for the welfare of the world, for the turning of the wheel of the universe, and the sole motive of his activity is that the world may grow and develop till the cycle is completed. 148. Sri Krishna then goes on to show the reasons for which a man should work, for the benefit and maintenance of the world and of mankind. No longer identifying himself with the separated forms, he has to identify himself with the one life which is carrying on separated lives in order to bring them to perfection. Thus identifying himself with the one life, he should work entirely for the welfare and maintenance of his fellows and of the whole world, that everything moving and unmoving may reach its appointed end. May become that which is in the thought of Ishvara, although in manifested life they have not reached that point. The whole universe of Ishvara exists perfect in his thought, and gradually in many stages he works that thought out in matter. Those who realize this as part of his life must work as he works for the complete manifestation of that thought, that is, in order to turn the wheel of life till the turning is complete. 149. It does not follow necessarily that the man who has this true and spiritual motive believes in God or thinks about him. But in any case he feels and responds to the divine life in the world, and serves it with utter devotion. Such, for example, was the case with my old friend Charles Bradlaugh, who did not believe in God as understood in his time, but was nevertheless always ready to face suffering and danger. To lay his own body in the ditch if it could thus be useful as a bridge over which others might walk to a higher life. 150. Yet those who have thus felt the will of Ishvara so that it has become their motive in life must not unsettle the minds of others who are not yet able to feel this and are acting from desire. Sri Krishna goes on to say. 151. As the ignorant act from attachment to action, O Bharata, so should the wise act without attachment, desiring the welfare of the world. 152. Let no wise man unsettle the mind of ignorant people attached to action. But acting in harmony with me let him render all action attractive. 11 Ibid, 3, 25-26. 153. The spiritual man must throw himself into the work of the world and set an example, because the standard which is set up by the wise will be followed by others. A man who is looked up to by the mass of the people sets a standard by which activity will be carried on by the others. If he becomes indifferent to action, they will also fall into indifference. Though his indifference may come from a higher motive, they do not know that, and it is quite a natural thing for them to mistake his motive. In them indifference would grow out of tamas, and that would prevent their further evolution. 154. A man might say, I don't want results here or in Swarga. Why then should I try to help other people along the road which leads to those enjoyments? Why should I try to make them active on those lines that I deem to be useless, that they may gain what is worthless? Why should I throw my activity on the side of giving that which is undesirable? The answer is perfectly clear. Those fruits of action are absolutely necessary for the mass of the people. Unless they desire these pleasures of the world, these comforts and ambitions, these things which move them to action, their evolution will be stopped. If they do not want enjoyment here, then Swarga may be their motive. Somehow they must be encouraged to move, grow, evolve. If you persuade them that these things are useless, they will not evolve. 155. It is therefore important for the evolution of mankind that an example should be set of work done thoroughly and perfectly well. It is never done perfectly well while we are men working from desire. Though in that case the man may show an admirable example of energy and perseverance, there will be the taint of selfishness in his work, which will make his example imperfect. He may work with great accuracy, but he is working for himself. He is not really doing his best, because he is not thinking entirely of the work, but partly of a result for himself. 156. The Lord works perfectly so that the world may go on. We should, then, work in the same spirit. We must work better than the best worldly man, because our motive is that of service to God and man, and not our own gain. We will work for the cause of humanity. We will not run about to find activity for the sake of being active. Many men work thus for the enjoyment of action, because unless they are busy they do not feel alive, but are bored. That condition is one very far removed from the man who is content in the self. He is never bored, never searching for an outlet in activity. 157. He works because it is his duty, and has no desire for activity when there is no duty. Thus he realizes inaction in action. In the fourth discourse of the Gita, Sri Krishna remarks on action, wrong action and inaction. 158. What is action, what inaction? Even the wise are herein perplexed. Therefore I will declare to thee the action by knowing which thou shalt be loosed from evil. 159. It is needful to discriminate action, to discriminate unlawful action, and to discriminate inaction, mysterious, is the path of action. 160. He who seeth inaction in action, and action in inaction, he is wise among men, he is harmonious even while performing all action. 11 Ibid, 4, 16-18. 161. Even the wise people are confused, it is said, as to the limits of each of these things. The right action is duty, that in which the man is expressing the life of Ishvara in his own place. In that he is to be a channel or agency, working with the knowledge, accuracy and completeness that the man who is not ambitious shows. If you take his work and put it beside that of the man who is ambitious, you will see that it is equally well, nay, even better done, because it is done with absolute self-surrender and perfect balance. 162. If you find a man who is not working in that way, having lost desire for the fruit of action, but who is doing less than he ought to do, is working with less energy, less interest and less punctuality because he has no longer personal motives, then you see one who has not learned the duty of action before he took to inaction. It was said to me regarding certain people, these men are beginning inaction before they have done action, by intellectual recognition of the worthlessness of the fruit of action before they have reached the point where they could work unselfishly. They are neither good men of the world, as they have stopped doing that, nor are they spiritual men throwing their energy into the evolution of mankind. 163. There are two lives which a man may live who has reached the condition where the fruit of action does not affect him. He may retire to the jungle to live in seclusion, or he may be busy amid the affairs of men. 1 Volume 1, Part 5, ch. 2, Love in Daily Life. Ch. 6, Service. If he is sufficiently evolved to work energetically in the mental or in the spiritual plane, that life of physical inaction may be the best. That man is helping the world much more than he could do amid the bustle of the world. Yet such a man will often be sent back by his master to lead his last life in the world. He will then live a life untainted by action, will show in the world the example of true action, will lead a life of perfect activity with all the energy that the most ambitious man can show. 164. When a man is living the spiritual life in the world, it is not possible usually to tell by external means whether he is moved by desire or by duty. But there is one test which never fails by which one may always judge one's own motive. How are you affected when the fruit of action is before you? If the slightest element of ambition enters into a man's work, he will show disappointment if it fails or elation if it succeeds. If there is no suffering for him in his failure, no element of personality has entered into his work. For if he has been working because Ishvara works, for the welfare of mankind, he will know his failure is not the failure of Ishvara, but that the failure is part of his plan. From the standpoint of Ishvara, failure is impossible, and often in human life failure is quite as necessary for ultimate success as success is necessary for ultimate success. His people may be sent sometimes to play the part of the failure so as to become stronger, to realize that where there is failure there is also success. 165. Whether a man is really working as part of his life will be shown by his perfect contentment whether he succeeds or fails. If that contentment is perfect, without a shadow of dissatisfaction, he has been working absolutely for the maintenance of mankind, then the work does not bind him and he has solved the problem of inaction in the midst of action. He has learned the use of the vehicles and the gunas, without identifying himself with them. In ordinary cases the gunas work the man, but the man on the path works the gunas. Most men are carried about by the energies of nature. They work as those energies are active. But the man on the path takes those energies as instruments of labor and, standing behind them, utilizes them. The ambitious man is driven by the gunas when he thinks that he is working, but the man who has transcended them is directing them along the road of evolution traced by Ishvara, and does not identify himself with them. This is thus taught in the Gita. 166, having abandoned attachment to the fruit of action, always content, nowhere seeking refuge, he is not doing anything, although doing actions. 167. Hoping for naught, his mind and self-controlled, having abandoned all greed, performing action by the body alone, he doth not commit sin. 168. Content with whatsoever he obtaineth without effort, free from the pairs of opposites, without envy, balanced in success and failure, though acting he is not bound. 169. Of one with attachment dead, harmonious, with his thoughts established in wisdom, his work sacrifices, all action melts away. 11 op. Cit. 4, 20-23. 170. So the man who finds himself at the point of balance, of indifference, must discover some means to increase the higher influences within himself, so that these may spur him into this life of spiritual action. He must use meditation. He must try to utilize whatever emotion he may possess, he must deliberately take every opportunity of service. He must move even without the desire to move, and even against the desire not to move. He must move. If he can find anyone for whom he has reverence, whose example inspires him to activity, that will be a great help to his getting over this transitional stage, where otherwise he might drop out of evolution for the time being. If the desire to please someone whom he admires should arise in his mind, he may use that to urge himself on until he is in a position to feel the impelling force of Ishvara's life. And thus use the emotion to carry him over and out of his condition of collapse. 171, CWL, having put aside ambition for himself, the man is then told to work as those work who are ambitious. There are usually 3 stages through which men pass. There is, first of all, the work for worldly result. Then comes the stage when the man begins to work, still for a result, but for a heavenly result. That is put very much before us by the different churches. We are to give up this world to live forever in heaven. We shall stand nearest to God's throne, and so on. Most people pass through these 2 stages of working, first for the worldly result and then for the heavenly result. Some of them somewhat improve upon that second idea, because they work in order to please their deity. Many Christians, for example, work for the love of Jesus, and that is admirable because it is unselfish. It is a higher stage than to work for a personal result, even though it be a heavenly one. 172, there is still a higher stage, that of doing the work for the work's sake, but most people do not understand that yet. Many artists do. There are artists who work for the sake of art in whatever their line may be. As one great poet said, "I do but sing because I must." He meant that he must express that which came through him as a message to the world. Another, feeling the same thing, said that he valued his poems not because they were his own, but because they were not. So there are some who work for the sake of art, not for themselves or for their own renown, not to please other people, not even to please God as that idea would be commonly understood. But because they feel the message coming through them and they must give it. That is a high stage to have attained. 173, then there is the highest stage of all, when a man works because he is part of the deity and as part of him he desires the fulfillment of the divine plan. People sometimes delude themselves and think they are working for that when they have still a considerable flavor of the lower ideas about them. We can always test ourselves with regard to that, best, perhaps, when we happen to fail, which occurs at times to all of us. As our great president has often explained, if we are really working definitely and knowingly as part of the deity, as part of the whole, we are not in the least disturbed by any failure that comes to us, because we know that God cannot fail. If for the time being a certain activity appears to be a failure, that is in the scheme and so is a necessary thing, and therefore is not really a failure. Nothing can be a failure from his point of view, so we are not in the least distressed. The only question would be as to whether it was our fault, but if we have done our best and the thing is still a failure, we know that all is well. 174. Such considerations as these must not, however, cause us to become negligent or indifferent to time. It is part of our work to convert others from the doctrine of inertia to the path of service, and even one such gain means that some distinct advantage has been achieved for the world. Whatever is best certainly, but only when we have done our best. If there is anybody who has failed to do his best in his share of that work, then whatever is not best, because it might have been better. It is only when we have done absolutely all, that we have the right to take refuge in that. Well, I have done everything I can. If after all I am not successful, I bow to a higher power than mine. I am very sure that that which has been done is after all not lost, and whatever happens to all these people in the end is really what is best for them. 175. It may be only an illusion, but it is a very powerful one, that high philosophical view that whether you get anything now or in a million years does not matter. I feel it matters to me. Therefore I think it must matter to other people, and if we could get them to take the earlier opportunity of advancing, we should be doing a very great thing for them. What difference it makes in the long run to the logos in whom all this is moving, I cannot tell, but it is very likely his wish that we should evolve, and if he wishes that to be done, then also he must wish that it should be done as soon as may be. We are clearly carrying out his will if we try to press onward along the path which leads to full unity with him, and if we help others along that path, so I cannot see that it is all the same whether people enter the stream in this world period, or this chain period, or wait till the next. I shall do all I can to help people to enter it in this one. 176. Perhaps another test would be as to whether we are willing to take any work that is his work, whether we are willing to help high and low alike. To him there is neither high nor low in the matter of progress, though some part of his scheme may be at a higher and another part at a lower point in that progress. It is very much like the turning of a wheel. Some part of it is approaching the top as it turns, but all of it alike is moving along as the wheel turns. Our work is to help the whole forward, to push any part of the wheel. The life at all levels is the divine life. It is more unfolded at some stages than at others, more unfolded in the human than in the animal than in the vegetable than in the mineral, but the life is the divine life everywhere. And if we are helping forward any part of that we are helping the divine plan. That which is higher or lower is the form in which the life is cast, the form permits of greater or lesser unfoldment, but the life is one life. That certainly must be part of his point of view, which is very different from our outlook, the idea that all life is in reality the same. There is no high nor low from that point of view, because the whole is moving together. That does not alter the fact that there may be some in whom the life is more unfolded, who are capable of giving greater assistance, and others who may be capable only of a lower grade of assistance. The point is that those who find that what they can do best would commonly be called lower work should not be in the least disheartened, because they also are pushing the same wheel, they are helping the unfoldment of the same divine life. Chapter 4. Rules 2-4. 177, 2. Kill out desire of life. 178, respect life as those do who desire it. 179, AB, we have already to some extent considered this aphorism and the next. The same general principles that apply to the killing out of ambition yet the working as those do who are ambitious apply to these two aphorisms also. The disciple must get rid of the desire for personal life, everything which energizes the personal self and responds to the gratification of his personal desire. He must no longer rejoice in the mere pleasure of expanding his own life by taking into it more and more of the outside things. 180. All over the world men are to be seen in eager search for a fuller life. They grasp it with many varieties of greed, struggling and fighting for more and more of everything that appeals to their hot and untutored imaginations, and thereby bringing about great quantities of personal and social trouble. But the disciple must get rid of that desire to increase and expand his own individual and separate life. He must enter into the higher life, and have only the desire to be wherever in the universe he is wanted at any time as an expression of the one life. There are many things to do in this universe. When all desire for separate individual life has been transcended, and all personal preferences are gone, the need of the time guides the choice of the spiritual man. Wherever help is wanted is the place of work for such a liberated soul. He cares only to be an instrument, wherever the instrument may be wanted. His life is to him only useful and valuable as it is part of the universal life. 181. The man who has lost his desire of life arrives at a point of danger. He may regard life as worthless for all, because the things that it offers are worthless to him. He may take up an attitude of contempt towards the world and his fellow men. He may look down upon and despise them, as foolish people, may speak of them contemptuously, and consider their motives paltry. That attitude towards them is very natural, but it is full of danger, and fundamentally evil. It shows that he has not realized the self, though he may have realized the non-self as such. If he looks down upon any life, however undeveloped, he forgets that that manifestation is a part of Ishvara, and to him therefore the message is necessary and urgent: respect life as those who desire it. 182. If he asks why he ought to look upon it with respect, the answer is, because it is divine. It is a stage in which Ishvara is working, a stage which to Ishvara is quite as important as the higher stage in which he now is. When we speak of high and low we speak from the standpoint of evolution and time, the succession of changes which make up time. That is not the way in which Ishvara regards his world. To him there is nothing great nor small, hateful nor dear. Everything is at a stage on a road on which all are traveling to the same goal. The lowly is just as necessary for the scheme of evolution as the form we usually call higher. So the disciple must not fall into the blunder of despising, and disregarding any life, because it is in what we call a low stage of evolution. Each thing in its place is right and good. The recognition of that fundamental truth means that a man must love his fellow men, must learn to care for them as part of the universal life in evolution. 183. Granted that a man in a low stage is foolish, sensual, idle, exceedingly unattractive, his lack of attraction lies in the form, not in the life. We are blinded by the form. Because our looking down upon another, our turning aside from him, is a sign of our superiority, there follows a feeling of superiority, which breeds contempt. But the truth is that the only thing in which we are superior is the evolution of the form. The essence is the same, his possibilities are equal to ours, and looked at from the center he is as we are. The man who is on the path tries to see things from the center as well as from the circumference. He must therefore respect life, and realize that the life of Ishvara is the only life. The form is that in which Ishvara chooses to manifest for a certain time, and if it is good enough for Ishvara it is quite good enough for us. 184. In the universe there must be form in all stages of growth. No one is higher or lower. All are equal. There is difference when we ourselves are in process of evolution, but no difference when we have outgrown it. When we have given up interest in it and thrown aside all question of forms and fruit, then we can respect life in all its manifestations. The partially evolved man, bound up by the forms, is willing to help those who are comparatively near himself and who can repay his trouble. He will not be inclined to help those who are low down. But the man who helps from the standpoint of Ishvara helps all. His duty is to help them wherever they are. His activity is to be the activity of Ishvara. He helps those who come in his way, whether they be high or low, and he respects the life in each of them, and helps that where help is required. He does not allow himself to be confused by the fact that the whole of the life is not present in the man. He knows that the work of Ishvara is carried on so that that life may be brought out, and he works to unfold it into manifestation. He is not led astray by thinking that to be in the self is everything. He works for manifestation, respecting and loving life. And so he utterly avoids the danger of contempt, which would otherwise hinder the unfolding of the life in himself by producing a wall of separateness. 185. There is in this an immense difference between the way in which life is regarded by an ordinary man and by one who lives in the eternal. The latter sees the life in its full possibilities, those possibilities to him being in view now, even though undeveloped, for he lives in the eternal, and when life is looked at from that standpoint it is seen in the beauty of its fulfillment. Below that state we see it only in a particular stage, in time and not in eternity, and therefore we do not respect it as we ought to do. But the liberated soul who lives in eternity sees it as it is, and although he looks at the stage at a particular time in which it has arrived, he cannot feel repulsion, because he knows that that stage is perfectly normal. 186. The practical outcome of it is that the higher a man stands the more is he tolerant of all life, and the greater is his compassion with all, approaching as it is the compassion of the Logos himself. As a man destroys in himself the desire of life, that is the desire of the separated self, and yet respects life as those do who desire it, he begins to acquire that sense of eternity which enables him to respect life in whatever way it may be manifested. For him then any contempt for those who are below him becomes impossible, he recognizes each in its place as an expression of the perfect life. 187, CWL. Here, as in the case of the former rule, we may take the teaching at two different levels. Undoubtedly the beginner has to kill out the desire for one kind of outer life rather than for another, such as would interfere with the work to be done. A man who becomes a pupil of the master must be absolutely willing to do whatever is put in his way, to go here or there, to leave this thing or that, and have no feeling about it. If he thinks, I am doing this kind of work and I am doing it well, and I want to keep on doing it, he may come to harm because he is becoming conceited. Suppose he is taken away from the work he feels he can do and is put to something which is new to him, he must accept it with perfect cheerfulness. The change may be made because this other work is more necessary, or because, since he has learned to do that one thing, he must now learn to do something else. 188. Quite outside the special training of the pupil, we frequently find that the evolutionary forces work in that way. Every man likes to do what he feels he can do well, but the evolutionary forces want to develop the man all round, and very often they take him away from what he can do and put him to something else that he cannot yet do well. Because they want him to develop some new power. If at first he cannot do it, he must work at it until he can. That is the way that evolution in general works, and the same thing applies to the training of the pupils of the master. If they can do a thing well they may be kept at it for some time, but then quite suddenly they may be sent along some other line, and they must be equally willing to do that other work also. So, certainly, the desire for one kind of physical life more than for another will have to be killed out. 189. At the higher level the same thing is true with regard to the life of the ego. The disciple knows, if he looks back on past incarnations, that his ego has come along certain lines, but he has developed certain qualities and can, from the point of view of the individuality, do well along those lines. He may be suddenly taken away from them. The individuality, the ego, must accept that which comes to it in the course of its training. And there also we must be free from any feeling that this work or this way is better than that. This is brought home to us when we meet with people of other ray or types. We feel that our ray and type is the best one. In theory we would admit that the others must be just as good as our own, but very few of us can feel really hearty sympathy with them. Thus, for example, one who has been working along philosophic or scientific lines might find it a little trying to have to turn his activities to art or ceremonial service. It is difficult to turn our sympathies round and let them flow freely along another line, but that is one of the things we must learn to do if necessary. 190. As soon as a man feels unity he gains the dispassionate view of things. All lines of work are then, in effect, the same to him, not that he can equally easily take up all, but he sees that, they all lead to the same point. The undeveloped man never understands this. Always he thinks that the man taking the higher standpoint is cold and hard and unsympathetic. That is because the lower man is thinking of himself and is wanting all sorts of personal satisfactions, whereas the other man is thinking only of the work to be done and is putting all his energy into that. When once the plan of work of the Logos dawns upon a man's horizon he sees that to the exclusion of everything else, and throws his energies into it, and whatever is best for that work he tries to do. Even as regards the smallest detail of everyday life. 191. He hitches his wagon to a star. He puts before himself ideals very high and very remote from the ordinary understanding, and it is quite inevitable that the people who still look on things from the personal point of view will misunderstand him. If he suffers because of that misunderstanding, there is still a little personal touch in that, he still wants to be understood, but even that he must give up. He must give up hoping that his efforts will be appreciated, and realize that it does not matter whether they are appreciated or not. All that matters is that the work shall be done. If people will not give us credit for our work, no matter. Let it be done as perfectly as possible. We shall have the appreciation of the Master, that much is sure, but even that must not be our reason for doing it. Our reason for doing it is that it is God's work and as we are one with Him what He wills is our will, what He would have done it is our highest pleasure and privilege to try to do. 192. When we realize that all life is divine life, of course we shall respect all the manifestations of it. We, who see partially, do not always respect life in all its forms and in all its manifestations. We see that many of them would be eminently undesirable for us, and therefore there is a tendency to regard those particular manifestations with contempt. That is always a mistake. We see a great deal around us which from our point of view is going very wrong, and often it really is going wrong. All the expressions of selfishness and greed and uncontrolled desire that we see in the world are certainly wrong in the sense that it would be very much better if they were different. It is not at all a mistake for us to think that, because it is a fact, but when we allow ourselves to feel contempt for the people who are at that stage, we are going further than we have any right to go. Their state of development accounts for these manifestations, and they are very often the only expressions possible for them at that stage, and it is through them that they will learn. 193. When we see a man showing selfishness and greed and lack of self-control, we say, "What a pity." Yet it is a pity only in the same sense that we might say that it is a pity that a little child of 4 has not grown up to be a man. If we allow ourselves to be uncontrolled, or to show greed and selfishness we might feel a sort of contempt for ourselves, because we know better, but it would be wrong to feel that for any other man. If it seems that he ought to be doing better, probably he has not taken advantage of his opportunities. Then we should feel sorry for him and try to help him, when we can, to see the better side, the higher possibilities, but it is the greatest mistake to draw away from him. Though we cannot always help feeling repugnance towards the things that he does. For example, if a man gets drunk it is because he is at that stage. He is a younger soul, therefore it is possible for him to yield to temptation of that kind instead of making a stand against it, as he ought to do. In many cases he has tried, perhaps, but has so far failed. All that we can do to help him should be thoroughly and entirely at his disposal, but we must not feel repugnance for him. It is the old Christian idea. We may hate the sin but we must be sorry for the sinner, otherwise we are doing worse than he, because we are losing the sense of brotherhood and destroying our power to help. 194. The one life is behind all and we must respect it even in manifestations which we dislike and feel to be undesirable. We must never forget that it is divine. It is difficult to remember that sometimes when the things that are done are so very ungodlike, nevertheless we must try. It is the old idea of the hidden life, which was taught to us in the Egyptian mysteries thousands of years ago. The hidden life was in every man, and however deeply it was buried and however little it showed forth, we were always to remember that it was there, even when we could not see it. The hidden light in us could not shine upon and evoke the hidden light in another at once, but if we were sufficiently patient and sufficiently forceful we must call forth a response, sometime and somehow. In these days we put the teaching in somewhat different terms, but it is equally true now as then. 195. The man who lives in the eternal sees what will be as well as what now is, and when he looks at a manifestation of life which is eminently undesirable he says, yes, at present, from the point of view of time. That is what I see it to be, a low and unworthy manifestation. But the divine life in Sit will someday blossom out. Many people do not think how very illusory a thing the present is. No sooner have we thought of it than it has passed. We say, such and such a thing is in existence at present, and while we are uttering the words that present moment has become the past. In reality there is no such time as the present, it is a kind of knife edge between the past and future. It is merely a term which we use for convenience, the thing itself is shifting every second of time. We must read the future into the present, and see what will be. If we could only get out of these bodies and these brains for a few moments into an altogether higher life and look down upon it, we should understand this matter exactly. We should see that by thinking of that future we make it more easily attainable for the present. If we look at a man who is definitely sinning, and think of his sin, we fold that sin more closely about him, but if we look at him and think of the future, when he will have risen out of it, we open the way to that future for him. And bring it more within his reach. 1 Anti. Volume 1, Part 5, Chapter 3, Gossip. 196, 3. Kill out desire of comfort. 197, Be happy as those are who live for happiness. 198, AB. In the early stages of growth a man puts out all his efforts brain and body in order to gain the means which will make him comfortable. The desire of comfort forms the motive of the majority of mankind. It is a very useful stimulus to bring out certain qualities of man. It teaches him that he must control his body, that he must dominate his lower nature, and that he has also to develop his bodies, so that they may subserve his purposes, of enjoying comfort in them. 199. The desire for comfort gradually disappears as the things that attract the man rise higher and higher in the scale. A man may get rid of desires for physical comfort and enjoyment by throwing his interest into the mental life, for example. At first there will be a sense of effort, a certain feeling of pain and loss, but the man prefers the mental to the physical pleasures because he knows that they will last longer. Then, as he practices self-denial, he finds that the feeling of loss becomes less and less as the joys of the intellect attract him more and more, until the lower desires do not attract him at all. 200. At first there is deliberate self-denial at each stage, and then comes the loss of the power of attraction in the physical object of the desire. Later on, the same change will come with regard to the joys of the intellect. When the man is looking up to the spiritual life his great attraction for intellectual things will gradually diminish, and he will be less and less attracted by the enjoyment of the powerful intellectual force. He will deny himself the joys of the intellect and rejoice in those of the spirit, he will withdraw himself from the intellect and fix his consciousness on the spiritual level. 201. The destruction of the desire for comfort also brings its danger. This is the third great danger. The first was inactivity, the second was contempt, and the third is the tendency not to be happy, but to be neither happy nor unhappy, neither one thing nor the other. 202. How shall the man become happy? The answer is, by realizing that the self is bliss. It is said in the Brahma Sutras that Brahman is bliss, Brahman is Ananda. The man has now to realize this. He is no longer moved by pleasure nor by pain. They have ceased to attract him. They came from contact between forms, but he has reached equilibrium. He is therefore likely to sink into the condition of being neither happy nor unhappy. But he must learn to be happy as those are who live for happiness. 203. It is the bliss of the self, that deep abiding bliss, the sense of contentment and joy, which is an essential part of the spiritual life, and the most difficult part of that life to realize in consciousness. It is a very marked fact about the great mystics and saviors of men that the side of sorrow has shown itself very much in their lives. Jesus was a man of sorrow. Gautama, the Buddha, left his splendid palaces and gardens and loving friends to seek the cure for the sorrow of the world. The same is true when we look on the lives of all the great leaders of mankind. Sorrow touched them very deeply. But they were not overcome by the sorrow. In those men there was an abiding joy, and the sorrow is profoundly exaggerated by the man who looks upon them from outside. As grief hovers over them, as anxiety, harassments, troubles, worries, and woes rain upon them from all directions, naturally they are judged by men to be sorrowful. But that does not follow. They are not worried, harassed or distressed by these things, however much they may attend to them, and may do whatever may be necessary for the sake of the world. Underneath it all there is the heart of peace. Therefore you always find them saying, "My peace remaineth." 204. The disciple feels the sorrow of the world. That he cannot escape, it will throw a shadow over him, an unavoidable shadow. The whole of the world's sorrow has to find its echo in him. He feels sorrow, and continues to feel pity for the ignorant and the suffering, for their rebellion and revolt. At the stage we are considering there is danger for him, that he may cease to feel for others, then just in proportion as he ceases to feel he loses his utility. The great ones feel helpless pity for those under the sway of karma. Pity because of their own inability to help them, for there are places where they cannot help, where men must go through their experiences by themselves. Despite the knowledge that it should be so, and despite their absolute contentment with the law, they are standing aside and watching it work, still there is this pain and sympathy, pity, which has in it a certain element of sorrow. 205. That will always remain as something of a shadow. In losing the power to sympathize a man would lose the power to help. Just as his life flows into the ignorant he feels the pleasure and pain of the ignorant, and he lightens their trouble by feeling it himself. 206. With all this pressing upon him it is ever necessary that the disciple should be reminded that the self is bliss. He must keep the heart of joy, must deliberately cultivate in himself the spirit of contentment and happiness. One way to do this is to practice meditation upon the divine bliss, deep, intense bliss, not equaled by anything belonging to this earth, because it is the very essence and nature of the self. A man can develop that aspect only by the deliberate cultivation of joy and contentment, and by looking at the world and recognizing that evil is avidya, unwisdom. In the midst of sorrows he is to be happy. He must teach himself that pain is in the vehicle while the life is ever joy. 207. CWL. This rule does not mean that people may not be comfortable, though many have taken it in that sense. Yogis, hermits and monks have taken similar statements in other scriptures in that way, but it is absolutely wrong and foolish. Some monks in the Middle Ages wore hair shirts. And some Indian yogis sit on spikes and sleep in the hottest weather in the midst of a circle of fire, all with the object of making themselves uncomfortable. That is, the result of choosing one text and running it to death. It is particularly stated in the Bhagavad Gita that those who torture the body torture the divine one seated in that body, and their way is not the way of progress. 1 Op. Cit. 17, 6. So this rule does not mean that we may not be comfortable, but simply that we must never let our desire for comfort stand in the way of any work which we have to do. If to do what ought to be done will cause us great discomfort, we must not on that account refrain from doing it. 208. To make ourselves unnecessarily uncomfortable only puts difficulty in our way. People talk much about the virtue of suffering and the extent to which progress is made through it, but if we look at the cold facts we shall find that the progress is made after the suffering is past. It is not actual suffering itself which causes the progress, but in many cases that wakens a man to conditions which otherwise he would not have sufficiently noted. It sometimes weeds out of him qualities which made progress difficult for him, but it is only after the suffering is over that the progress is made, because only then is he in a fit state of mind to attend to higher things. 209. We must not think that there is any virtue in making ourselves uncomfortable. On the contrary, when the physical body is comfortable we are much better able to think of higher things. Yet I have known people who would persist in doing it. For example, in India where meditation is best understood, it happens to be the custom to sit cross-legged. I have known scores of white people who would weary themselves out and even cause themselves pain by trying to follow the Indian custom in meditation. Not understanding that that is merely an outer detail and the Indian only adopts that position because he has been accustomed to it from childhood. It is exceedingly futile for people who are not accustomed to it to force themselves into what is to them a position of discomfort. Patanjali's direction is to take a posture easy and pleasant. 210. There are two objects with regard to the position of the body during meditation. First, it should be comfortable, so that one can easily forget it, for that is what one wants to do. Secondly, it should be such that if in meditation we leave the body, which may happen at any time, it will not hurt itself. In such a case the effect on the body will be as though we had fainted. The Indian who is sitting on the floor simply falls backwards, and no harm is done. When we meditate we shall do well, therefore, to sit in some sort of armchair, so that we may not fall out of it, if the body loses consciousness. The recumbent position is not good if it increases the tendency to sleep. 211. There are joys of the emotions and of the intellect, and many people who would despise the idea that their physical comfort mattered to them in the least, are yet exceedingly unhappy when they are not emotionally comfortable, that is to say, when they imagine that they are not getting the response they deserve to their emotions. Many people are painfully sentimental and expect the rest of the world to be equally so, and are much hurt because it is not. They pour out what they call affection, but it is often tinged with selfishness. They will create all kinds of disturbance, and even do things which harm those whom they profess to love, all for the sake of what they call the return of their affection. They do not understand that there are different types of affection, and that it may be absolutely impossible for the person concerned to return it in their particular way. This difficulty comes from the insistence of the desire for emotional comfort, which should never be permitted to interfere with our own progress or that of those whom we love. 212. In the same way there is intellectual comfort. People want others to think exactly as they do, so that they may rest mentally content, without disturbance. Constantly we come up against that difficulty. There will be some promising young person deeply interested in theosophy, for example, who wants to join the society, but his parents vigorously oppose him. They would not be intellectually comfortable if they thought that their son or their daughter were adopting a line which they could not share. They feel sure that they are right and that there can be no real wisdom outside the limits of their own particular opinions. Therefore if a son or a daughter thinks differently from them they are quite outraged, not realizing that the fact that an ego happens to be born in their family does not necessarily mean that he is of the same temperament as themselves. 213. Each ego has his own way, his own power of appreciating the truth, he must receive it along his own line. For others to try to force him to take it along their line, which is not his, is a mistake, the whole inner self revolts against it. The result, in hundreds of cases, when children have been intellectually pressed, is that they fall away altogether from their parents' beliefs. Again and again, for example, the son of a clergyman ends as an atheist, because the father and mother have unwisely tried to force him to think along their lines. This harm is done only because they themselves want to be intellectually comfortable. The disciple must always be careful that his desire to be emotionally or intellectually comfortable does not make him interfere with other people's rights, and that he does not let it stand in the way of duty or of help that he might give. 214. It is essential that we should be happy, as the Chohan says here, although certainly we do not live for happiness. I think many forget the duty of happiness. They do not regard it as a duty, although most emphatically it is that. It is a necessary part of progress. The person who is always mournful and depressed about what is happening is making no progress, and it is well that he should understand that. As I have said before, it is necessary that we should become more and more sensitive, because unless we bring ourselves into that condition we cannot answer in a moment to the slightest signal from the Master. It is unquestionably difficult to be very sensitive and at the same time radiantly happy, yet that is what we must be. There is a great deal that calls for the deepest sympathy, and it is difficult to feel sympathy with those who are suffering, without also feeling sorrow. Yet, as I have explained, the Master sympathizes far more than we can, but certainly does not feel the sorrow as sorrow. 1. 215, 1 Anti, Volume 2, page 329. 216. There might be very much less suffering and very much less sorrow if the people to whom the sorrow and suffering are coming now had lived quite differently in other lives, perhaps thousands of years ago. But considering that they lived as they did, that which is now happening is the best that can happen for their progress. We cannot help being sorry that it is not better, but our sorrow is not for what is going on now, but for the previous happenings which made this necessary. Possibly that sounds a little cold, but when we understand how utterly the result is part of the cause, we can see that what is happening now is actually part of the causes which the people themselves set in motion long ago. And it could not be other than it is while the divine law of cause and effect is operating. 217. All this suffering can only be altered now by bringing in new forces. We can sometimes relieve sorrow and suffering to a certain extent. Whenever we do that, it is not in the least that we abrogate the working of the law, it is not at all that everything does not flow in harmony with that law, but that we introduce a new force which also comes within the operation of the law, and mitigates much which otherwise would have been the effect of what went before. But though we can sometimes relieve and help, it is, as I explained before, quite difficult for many of us to get always into the attitude of being perfectly sympathetic and yet recognizing the necessity of the suffering. Though we can do it quite well in certain things. Suppose some friend whom we love very much has to undergo a surgical operation. Of course we are sorry that it should be so, but it does not occur to us to say that it ought not to be so, because we recognize that the operation is intended to do good, and we trust that its result will be an improvement in his health. Therefore, however sorry and anxious we may be, we regard it as an unfortunate, a regrettable, necessity. All sorrow and suffering are nothing but that, operations to remove dangerous growths. 218. Much of the sorrow of the world can be avoided, because a great deal of it does not come from the past but is the result of men's present foolishness. They take things in a wrong way. For example, we frequently allow ourselves to be hurt or offended or worried. That is not karma from the past. In many cases 7/8 of the trouble which comes to people is not from without at all. It is due entirely to the way in which they take their experiences. The karma that comes to us from without is only a small amount, but we magnify it very greatly, that is our present fault, and it can be remedied. 11 Anti, Volume 1, Part 1, ch. 1, The Occult Path and the Interests of the World, Part 4, ch. 1, Control of Mind, ch. 4, Cheerfulness, Volume 2, pages 141, 218, 244. 219. Most people who live for happiness seek to attain that happiness in various ways, by surrounding themselves with the people with whom they feel happy, by going where they expect to find enjoyment, and so on. That the disciple should not do, because he ought to be in the position of being perfectly happy in himself, without reference to particular outer conditions. That is difficult for us, because, through many lives we have been very largely the sport of circumstances. If we observe people we shall find that most of them are in that condition still. The majority of people in the world make very little effort to change the conditions in which they find themselves. If they find themselves depressed or readily offended and therefore unhappy, they should set to work to change those conditions. Instead of doing that they grumble about those who offend them, and say that it is quite impossible to get on with such people. Yet those others are probably people very much like the rest of the world. Our happiness depends upon how these people are taken, upon our attitude towards their attitude. If our study of occultism has brought any fruit we will say, I do not mind what position they take up, that is their business, not mine. My business is to take care that I am not offended and worried, that I preserve a peaceful condition, whatever these other people do or think. 220. One may say that it is very difficult to do that, if other people are aggressive or insulting. But is it not obvious that the effect produced by the insulting and aggressive attitude depends upon the way in which it is met? If we allow ourselves to be affected by it, a great deal of disturbance is set up. We on our side show something of the same nature, and to the onlooker it would seem that some of that aggression is justified. But if we are perfectly calm, the man who abuses us puts himself in the wrong, and the outsider can see that we are not in the wrong. Of course, we should not remain calm in order to appear in the right, but we should adopt a philosophical attitude, because we do not feel these attempts to attack us or to interfere with us, and thus we can be happy. 221. That seems a sort of negative happiness, to avoid pain or suffering. We can do a great deal more than that. We who are trying to live according to the precepts of occultism, students of the inner life, must be doing something of the world's work. Assuredly no one can see the plan of the Logos, and the work that is to be done to carry out that plan, without trying to do as much as he can for it, and the fact that he is engaged in that work keeps a man busy and happy. We should have no time for depression, no time to worry about all these outer things. If we are all the time busily engaged in pouring out good thought, in sending strong wishes, strong currents of goodwill to all around us, we are fully occupied, and are happy in the work itself. 222. It is sad to see the way in which people all about us are constantly talking about doing things, to pass the time. They do this or that for the sake of having something to do. It is both ludicrous and pitiable, because the world is full of opportunities to do good and noble deeds, and these people are not even looking for the opportunities. They are just trying somehow or other to amuse themselves, that they may get through the time, a most extraordinary attitude to take. 223. The student of occultism finds that he cannot get time enough to do all that he would like to do. All those who are really willing to work are overwhelmed with work, there is always more to be done than they can possibly do. Dar. Bezanт works indefatigably from early in the morning until very late at night without any rest, and hers is a very different thing from the ordinary man's idea of work. Some men who are in business are certainly closely occupied the whole time, but most people's idea of work is to do a little and have a rest, and then take the matter up again and spend a little more time at it. They would call that very close attention to work. That is not the way in which she works. Even while she is listening to some story that is being told to her, she will continue writing and still know every word of what one is telling her, and be perfectly ready at the end of the story to give help or advice. She loses no single moment. She is always prepared, if she happens to be waiting at a railway station, to take out a little dispatch box and begin writing articles or letters at once. It is not given to every one, and think of the age which her body has now reached, to do that, especially as a great deal of the work is of a very searching character, and calls for quick decision in many different directions. People who are paid for work do not do it in that way. It is precisely because all that she does is done for the love of it that she is able to do so much. Certainly she is happy in her work, always ready to meet people with a friendly smile, and is thus a great inspiration to all those who come into contact with her. We would do well to follow in her steps as far as we can, remembering always the duty of happiness. If we are not happy, then we are not doing enough, it is a sure proof that we are wasting time. We should get to work and do something, and at once the unhappiness will vanish, because there will not be time for it. The interest in the work is so keen and the amount to be done so great, that we shall find ourselves thinking of that, and we shall have no time to think of anything in the nature of unhappiness. 224. Seek in the heart the source of evil and expunge it. It lives fruitfully in the heart of the devoted disciple as well as in the heart of the man of desire. Only the strong can kill it out. The weak must wait for its growth, its fruition, its death. And it is a plant that lives and increases throughout the ages. It flowers when the man has accumulated unto himself innumerable existences. He who will enter upon the path of power must tear this thing out of his heart. And then the heart will bleed, and the whole life of the man seem to be utterly dissolved. This ordeal must be endured. It may come at the first step of the perilous ladder which leads to the path of life, it may not come until the last. But, O disciple, remember that it has to be endured, and fasten the energies of your soul upon the task. Live neither in the present nor the future, but in the eternal. This giant weed cannot flower there, this blot upon existence is wiped out by the very atmosphere of eternal thought. 225, CWL. This is the remainder of Rule 4, the Chohan's comment on the first 3 rules. The giant weed is the heresy of separateness, the idea of the separated self, which is truly the source of evil. We are directed to kill it out by stages. We are told first to unify the lower and the higher self, that is to say, to merge the personality in the individuality. For most of us the personal self is still so near that it tends to shut out the higher things. We have to work our way through that and gradually to transcend it, to get entirely rid of all selfishness. Then we have to begin upon the individuality. 226. Now, the individuality, the ego, is a very wonderful thing, complex, exceedingly beautiful and marvelously adapted to its surroundings, a glorious being indeed. Yet eventually we must realize that even that is only an instrument that we have created by the working of many ages for the sake of the progress of the monad. Because we have had to develop the idea of the separated self in the earlier stages of our progress, the giant weed, or the seed of it, is in the heart of everybody. That has to be killed out at one time or another, yet only the strong can tear it out from themselves at the beginning of their development. The weak must wait and let it go on growing while they are developing sufficient strength to kill it out. That is unfortunate for them, because the longer it is allowed to persist the more closely it becomes intertwined with the nature of the man. Those who can summon the courage to tear it out now will make rapid and much surer progress. Terrible as the struggle is to get rid of this separated self at any time, it will be thousands of times more difficult if we leave it until the later stages of our progress. Until it is finally destroyed we shall be subject to all kinds of difficulties and dangers from which we can escape only by getting rid of it here and now. Obviously, therefore, it is best to kill it out in the beginning. 227. All systems of occult teaching agree in advising students to try from the very beginning to get rid of this illusion. The difficulty in the way, apart from the habit of thinking of ourselves as separate, is that this idea has been the source of all our strength in the past. When the ego was first formed as an individual he was distinctly weak. He had been, until then, part of a group soul, and the idea of separate identity was not strong in him. It had to be intensified through the savage life. The man's strength gradually grew from the feeling, I am I. In the earlier days it would be, I am a great fighter and a swift runner, I am a mighty headsman, I can lead armies, I can guide men, I can make them do as I will. Later on, it would express itself on a higher level as, I have a mighty intellect. I can trust myself, I am proud of myself, I am a great man, I can think more strongly than other men and therefore I have power over their minds, and can sway them to do this or that. It is through the sense of separateness that we have learnt to be self-reliant. 228. Later there comes a stage when self-reliance means reliance upon the higher self. The man no longer relies either on the skill of his hand, the fleetness of his foot and the strength of his muscles, or on his intellectual powers. But comes to realize that there is a strength of the spirit which is greater far than all these outer manifestations. And when this stage is reached he soon begins to see that the strength of his spirit is the strength of the infinite that lies behind it, because it is one with God himself. Thus our self-reliance at last becomes reliance on him, on the mighty power behind. We are he, and in relying on God we are relying on ourselves, because each of us is a spark of the divine, and the Godhead is in us. We only need to realize that and to unfold it, and then the self on which we rely becomes the great self which is the all. 229. This idea of the separated self is ingrained in us and is part of the very ego which is the one permanent thing about us as far as we know. We have still to learn that there is the monad. That will seem the true self when we have laid aside the individuality. Yet when that time comes we shall see far more clearly than we do now that those monads are only sparks of the eternal flame. We know it now theoretically, and true realization of it will come to all in due course. It has come to some already. I have explained before that when the consciousness is focused in the highest part of the causal body it is possible to look up the line that joins the monad and the ego. Looking up that line into the monad of which we know so little, and beyond it, we can see and know with a definiteness and certainty that no words can express down here, that all we have thought of as the self and as belonging to us, is not we, but he. That if we had any intellect, any devotion or affection, it was not we at all, but it was the intellect, the devotion, the love which is God, which was showing itself forth through us. 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 2, ch. 2, The Life of the Bodies. When a man has had that experience he can never be quite the same again, he cannot come down again in the same way to the personal point of view, because he knows with the certainty that convinces. Some experience like that is needed to counteract the result of the development of the separated self which at present is a great trouble and causes us much sorrow and suffering by obscuring our view of life. We are in this curious position that our self-development is due to the idea of separateness up to a certain point, and it is only when we have reached that point that it becomes an evil, and we have to get rid of it. Humanity has now reached a stage where it ought to be realizing that. That is why the duty of unselfishness is impressed upon us so strongly by all occult and high religious teaching. Humanity as a whole needs that. It is still in the selfish stage, trying to grasp this and that for itself. The whole of our strength must be turned against that tendency. 230. At the same time we must try to be very tolerant about it. We often feel impatient with the rampant, the brutal selfishness found everywhere, but that is useless. These unfortunate people are only carrying on now what was necessary for their development thousands of years ago. We should help them, if possible. We should always be gentle and tolerant, but very firm as to the necessity for getting rid of this point of view. Some of us find it helpful to try to realize the progress of humanity as a whole and to make a practice of thinking of ourselves as part of it. We try to act on the advice given by one of our masters who once put it thus: if you succeed in taking a step of some kind, if you succeed in making definite advancement, you should not think, I have done this, I am really getting on. The better way to put it is, I am glad that this has happened, because humanity through me is just that much nearer to finding itself, that much nearer to the final goal which God means it to reach. Humanity through me has taken this step, and the fact that it has done so means a very little advance for every other unit. One may thus think of the whole of humanity, as a man thinks of the whole of his family, as a unit, from the baby to the old grandfather, and so considers the welfare of all. 231. We are told that we should live neither in the present nor the future, but in the eternal. He who lives in the eternal is the Logos, the deity. He, living in the eternal, sees the future as well as the present, sees the fulfillment of all these things. If we could raise ourselves up into his point of view we should be able to live in the eternal as he does. That is not a thing that we can achieve today or tomorrow. We must fight our way towards it. A divine dissatisfaction is a necessity for our progress towards it. We must never be satisfied with the condition we have reached. That would at once mean stagnation. We must always aim at doing better and better, and by living in the future we shall learn how to do that. 232. At the same time, while we are always reaching forward, always striving upward, it is a mistake to allow ourselves to feel discontented or worried with regard to transitory happenings to the temporary condition of ourselves and others. It is wiser and better to project ourselves into the future and live in it. We should say, I am at the moment such and such a person, with certain faults and failings. I am going to transcend these faults and failings. Let me look forward to the time when they will no longer exist. It is a great thing to live for tomorrow and not for yesterday. The world at large is living for the centuries which lie behind it and is clinging to old prejudices. We should look forward to the future and live for that. 233. Keep your thought hopefully on the future, not regretfully on the past. The present is very largely an illusion. So we are not really dissatisfied with what we are doing, but with what we have just done. If we want to get on, we must keep our eyes in front of us. To look behind is not the way to make progress. If that course were persisted in on the physical plane, we should not go far without meeting with an accident, and the same thing is true in these higher realms also. The more we think over it, the clearer it becomes that in the three aphorisms we have just been examining, viz. Kill out ambition, kill out desire of life, and kill out desire of comfort, all that moves the ordinary man to exertion has been absolutely cut away. 234. A man's life is first of all directed by the desire to keep himself and his family alive, to keep his head above water. He has always the ambition of rising to higher levels, he wishes for greater comfort for himself and for his family. These are precisely the mainsprings which move the ordinary man, and it is obvious that if all of them should be absolutely removed from him, he would be left supine, he would be left without any reason to bestir himself at all. He would be like a log. He would say, if I am not to have ambition of any sort, if I am to cease to desire either life or comfort, why should I do anything? Why should I move at all? He would be left without any adequate motive for exertion of any kind, and all progress for him would be at an end. It is obvious that for him the killing out of these things would have a bad effect. 235. Even the man who is nearly ready to tread the path, who has ceased to feel any interest in lower things, reaches a stage when there is danger of his falling into a state of inaction. Intellectually he is absolutely convinced that all these lower things are not worth pursuing, and because they have ceased to attract him he does not feel inclined to put forth energy in any direction. That is an experience which comes to nearly every one in the course of his evolution, and is a very real trouble to numbers of people. They have got rid of the lower and not taken on the higher. They are at a transition stage between the two. They have not sufficiently realized the unity for that to be the great motive power in life, but they have realized enough of it to know that the desires of the separated self are not worth following. So they remain in a condition of suspended animation. It is for some students a very great difficulty to rouse themselves out of this state. Nothing is worthwhile, nothing has any longer any interest for them. They want to die and be done with it. 236. The only way for a man to get beyond that unsatisfactory condition is to go a little further, and then he will begin to see that there is a higher and truer life which is infinitely well worth the living. He will find that when he has glimpsed the divine scheme he wants to throw himself into it, he cannot do otherwise. In identifying himself with the one life, and acting as part of that life, he finds the one motive which can stir him to action. When he takes that one step further and begins to realize the life of the self, then instead of wanting to fall into annihilation and to be done with everything, he will long to possess more and more energy in order to throw it into this glorious work. The motive power of the one self will stir him to far greater activity than ever before, because it is infinitely more powerful than any lower motive. And the man who works with it to fulfill the high purposes of the deity will gain infinite happiness and infinite peace. Chapter 5. Rules 5-8. 237, 5. Kill out all sense of separateness. 238, yet stand alone and isolated, because nothing that is embodied, nothing that is conscious of separation, nothing that is out of the eternal, can aid you. 239, ab. This teaching is specially given in this book, intended for the disciple, because he has to learn to stand utterly alone. Nothing that is embodied, that is out of the eternal, can aid him. All help that comes from the embodied is secondary help and may fail him in the moment of his greatest need. The biographies of the great Christian mystics show it to have been an invariable characteristic of their lives that they felt forsaken by every one, and had to stand absolutely alone. The same truth comes out also in the Christian Gospels, which contain in the symbol of the life of Jesus an account of the experiences through which every soul must go in the stages of discipleship. There are two scenes which are connected with this statement. The first is that which is spoken of as the agony of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he found that his friends and followers could not watch with him even for a little time, and he learned that he must go on alone. The second was the cry from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" These experiences are connected with the fourth great initiation, when the man is thrown back upon himself and learns to rest upon the inner self alone, to realize that he himself is only an expression of the eternal in the outer world. There is always a danger that in this last great test the disciple will break down. 240. A double task lies before the disciple. He must kill out the sense of separateness, but he must learn to stand alone in order that he may be strong with the strength of the divine within himself. He must be like a star in heaven, that gives light to all but takes it from none. He can learn that only from the experience of isolation. Yet the sense of isolation is illusory, for he is in the eternal. The illusion is due to the breaking away of all the forms before the realization of unity, of being the eternal, develops in the consciousness. 241. This aphorism with its comment also contains other important thoughts. There is a stage at which the aspirant must stand aside from the body of men, because of his weakness, not of his strength. Sometimes a man is so near the condition of other men around him, who still lead the lower life that he has left, that he feels that by keeping company with them he is likely to be dragged down into their vices. At that time the sentiment of repulsion is useful, and although it does show that he is in a lower stage of development, yet he will do well to follow it and avoid their company. 242. When a man speaks with horror of a certain vice, you may be sure that in the near past he has been in the grip of it. In the recent past there has been a fight against that vice, and his inner consciousness, from which nothing disappears, now warns him against it. There is a stage when a man has risen higher, when he need not seek such isolation from those who are still sinning. But so long as that is not the case, so long as he is liable to fall into vice on account of an impulse from outside, a man's safety lies in his running away from the temptation. Until he is strong enough to go amidst that vice without being attracted by it. Only when a man has got beyond the power of falling into attraction by vice will he usually get over his horror and repulsion. 243. Then he has come to the stage at which he ought to think of the sinner as in need of his help. The very thought of his own past faults will now enable him to help others. We cannot help them as long as we ourselves are liable to fall, but only when we are neither attracted nor repelled, when we recognize our identity with those who are struggling. We then remember that the sin of the world is our own sin. The profound truth that no man can be perfectly clean while another remains unclean. While a man remains part of humanity, its life is his. To escape from that, he must go outside humanity. The vice of any man is our vice, until he also has got rid of it. Upon that truth the saving of the world entirely turns. 244. That should be the thought of any disciple if he should find himself under special temptation. He should realize that he must not yield to the temptation, because in his fall there is a fall for the whole of humanity. Such knowledge ought to be sufficient to keep him from evil. Suppose you attempt to realize in consciousness the life of humanity, and then try to conquer a particular weakness, you will then feel that your own conquest is not a conquest for yourself, but for all. The whole of humanity is helped because one part of it has struggled and conquered. This idea will very often give you great strength. It is indeed worth while to struggle for the sake of the whole, if not for your own personal self. 245. C. W.L. People sometimes make these instructions harder for themselves than they need be, and perhaps also a little unreal, by exaggerating them. We have to face the fact that there is separation down here on the physical plane. We may feel as completely fraternal as we can, but the fact nevertheless remains that in space our physical bodies are separate. Sometimes people want to deny that fact. They try to carry the idea of non-separateness to such a point as to make it unreasonable. That can never be right in occultism. Occult teaching is always the very essence of reasonableness and common sense, and whenever anything is put before us which is obviously unreasonable, we may feel sure there is a mistake somewhere. In some cases it may appear unreasonable because we are not in possession of all the facts, but when the facts are all before us and the statement still has an unreasonable appearance, we are justified in doubting it and waiting for further enlightenment. 246. though our physical bodies are separate in space, there is really less separation than there appears to be. We all react upon one another to such an extent that no man can in any sense really live to himself alone. If one physical body has a certain disease, all the others near are liable to contract it. If the astral body is diseased in the sense of being, let us say, given to irritability, envy, jealousy, selfishness and so on, it is also infectious, because it radiates out its vibrations. And other astral bodies in the neighborhood must be to some extent affected by such radiation. When, for example, people sit together at a meeting, their astral bodies interpenetrate to a considerable degree. Because the astral body of an ordinary person extends about 18 inches around the physical body, in some cases still further, so that, although they are still quite separate, they must react considerably on one another. The same is true of the mental body, and even our causal bodies are separate in space and in condition. So we must understand this killing out of the sense of separateness in conformity with the facts of nature. 247. There is no separateness on the Buddhic plane. Their consciousnesses do not necessarily merge instantly at the lowest level, but they gradually grow wider and wider until, when we reach the highest level of the Buddhic plane, and have fully developed ourselves through all its different subdivisions, we find ourselves consciously one with humanity. That is the lowest level at which the separateness is absolutely non-existent. In its fullness the conscious unity with all belongs to the next plane, the nirvanic. 248. Suppose that all of us could develop the Buddhic consciousness within ourselves simultaneously. Each one would realize that he had risen to that level, and that his consciousness included that of all the others, but he would still feel that inclusive consciousness to be his consciousness. None of us would have lost his sense of individuality at all, only in it he would include very much more than he had ever done before. He would feel himself as manifesting through all these others as well. Really what we are experiencing is the one consciousness which includes us all, the consciousness of the Logos himself. 249. It is on the nirvanic plane that we realize most intensely that all that we thought to be our consciousness, our intellect, our devotion, our love, were in reality his consciousness, his intellect, his love, his devotion. Manifesting through us somewhat as a light might shine through a lens. That realization does not come fully to the man in the Buddhic world, but it does so come to him in that next above. 250. In the stanzas of Zion it is said, referring to man, the spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of Fohat. 1. The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 66. That, I believe, is applicable at various levels. For us it may be taken to mean that the ego hangs from the monad by the finest thread, and that thread runs through the Buddhic plane. The finest thread of which you can think is all that represents the ordinary man at these Buddhic levels. As soon as he turns his attention to higher matters, when he is regularly thinking of them and aiming at them, that thread begins to thicken. It gradually becomes more and more like a cable, and later on it appears as a funnel, because it widens out up above. I am speaking of it now as one would see it clairvoyantly, and comes down into the causal body, which is a thing of definite size for the time. Later on the causal body itself is enlarged by the inrushing of forces, and the funnel becomes very much larger, widening out at the bottom as well as the top. At the first initiation, for many, this experience comes before that, the man abandons the causal body and plunges into the Buddhic plane. At that time, as I have explained before, the causal body absolutely vanishes, the one thing that has seemed permanent through his long line of lives, since he left the animal kingdom, disappears. 2. Anti, Volume 1, Part 2, ch. 2. The life of the bodies. When that occurs, this funnel shapes itself into a sphere. There are more dimensions there, so that I cannot actually describe it, but this is how it appears to one who is able to see it. 251. After a man has taken the first initiation, the sense of separateness is one of the failings which have to be entirely conquered before he can take the second. It is the first of the 10 sanyajana or fetters which he has to cast off on his way up the steps of the path. It is made possible for him finally and irrevocably to cast it off by the experience which is part of that first initiation. He gets then merely a touch of the Buddhic consciousness. It does not mean necessarily that he can go back into that condition of consciousness whenever he will, but at least he has experienced it, and having once felt the unity. He knows that it exists even though he may be incapable of re-entering it without the aid of the Master. He knows, therefore, that the sense of separateness is an illusion. It is practically impossible for us down here in the physical body to grasp that really. We constantly speak of it and we try to persuade ourselves that we feel it, but as long as one is in a physical body and until one has had that higher experience, frankly I do not think one can feel it. We persuade ourselves of it intellectually, but really to feel it is a different thing. 252. When a man begins to function on the Buddhic plane, he enters it at its lowest level, but he is unable at first to make the most even of that lowest subplane. He will feel an intensity of bliss which no words can express, and an extension of consciousness which by contrast with anything which he has ever felt before, will no doubt give the idea that the whole world is included. Nevertheless it is not so at all. When he is sufficiently accustomed to this higher level to analyze it, he will find that the extension of consciousness, though a very great one, is by no means as yet full or universal. Gradually he extends the sphere which he can effectively occupy. It is somewhat like the way in which an army occupies a conquered territory. He establishes himself first, and then gradually extends that part over which he has definite power, until it includes the entire country. He then proceeds to try to push his consciousness into the next subplane. But even after he has worked his way through subplane after subplane until he reaches the highest, he has not necessarily built the Buddhic vehicle. The man who has the Buddhic consciousness within his reach by meditation or by effort can always raise himself into that condition. The man who has definitely built a Buddhic vehicle has that consciousness all the time in the background of his lower physical, astral or mental consciousness. That is another and separate achievement and a difficult one, because to do that the causal body must be eliminated, must be destroyed as a separating wall. 253. One whose consciousness works on the Buddhic plane during meditation finds that although he is one with all the wonderful consciousness of the plane, yet there is a little circle of emptiness shutting him out from the rest. This little barrier is, of course, the causal body. In order that the Buddhic vehicle shall be developed, even that must disappear. Then the man feels the reality of unobstructed life in a way impossible to describe down here. Madame Blavatsky expressed the idea as a circle with its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere, a very beautiful and expressive description. 1 Anti, Volume 2, page 67. Of course it is a paradox, but all things that can be said about these higher conditions must necessarily be paradoxical. 254. When the unity is fully realized, the man feels, however paradoxical it may sound, as though his vehicle at that level filled the whole of the plane. As though he could transfer his point of consciousness to any place within that plane and still be the center of the circle. It is an experience which is quite indescribable. Along with that feeling, permeating and accompanying it always, is a sense of the most intense bliss, bliss of which we can have no conception at all on these lower planes, something vivid, active, fiery beyond all imagination. Most bliss down here, at the rare moments when we feel anything deserving of the name, consists chiefly in the absence of pain. We are happy and blissful down here when, for a moment, we are free from fatigue and pain, when we can relax and feel that we are taking in pleasant influences. That is rather a negative feeling. The bliss of the Buddhic plane is the most intensely active, vivid feeling. I do not know in the least how to express it. If you could imagine the most intense activity that you have ever felt and then replace that vivid and strenuous activity by a feeling of bliss, then somehow raise it, spiritualize it, to an altogether higher plane, to the nth power. It would convey some idea of what that feeling is. 255. It is an active reality which is quite overpowering in its strength. There is nothing at all passive about it, one is not resting. Down here we live lives of so much strain and strenuousness that rest is always a very prominent part of any ideal we may have, but there it is not in the least a feeling that one is resting or wanting to rest. One is a tremendous incarnate energy whose expression is to pour itself forth, and the idea of rest or the need of rest is entirely outside one's consciousness. What to us here seems rest would seem a kind of negation up there. We have become one with the expression of the divine power, and that divine power is active life. People talk of the rest of nirvana, but that is from the lower point of view. It is the intensity of power that is the real characteristic of this higher life, a power so intense that it does not show itself in any sort of ordinary movement at all, but rather in one vast resistless sweep which might look like rest when viewed from below, but which means the consciousness of absolute power. It is impossible to express all this in words. When we have achieved this, we have finally conquered the giant weed, the great enemy, the sense of separateness. It is the hardest task, on the whole, that is before us, because it involves everything else. 256. It is only after the Buddhic body is fully developed on all the 7 subplanes that the man has the full fruition of the whole plane, a complete power of identification with the whole of humanity. So that he can learn through that relation what all these people think and feel. Before that Buddhic consciousness is gained, we may labor to reduce the sense of separateness, and it may be done with great success intellectually, but we still remain outside, in the sense of not understanding others. They will still be an absolute mystery, for man is the greatest of mysteries to his fellow man. We may come into very close relations with people for quite a long time, and yet not really know them inside. It may be that until the Buddhic level is reached no man ever really knows any other man thoroughly. 1 Anti, Volume 2, page 67. When a man reaches that condition, he is able to pour himself down into the consciousness of others and see what they do and why they act in that particular way. There all things are within him instead of outside, and he studies them as parts of himself. It sounds impossible down here, but that is something of what he feels. All the joy of the world is his joy, its suffering is his suffering. When he chooses to put himself down through any one of the million tentacles, the consciousnesses of other people with which he is one, then he can and does experience all which that person is experiencing. In this way all the world's suffering is within his reach, but he knows with absolute certainty that it is a necessary part of the plan and has no existence on those higher levels. He is in no way less sympathetic with it, yet he knows that Brahman is bliss, and that to be one with the divine is a state of perpetual inner joy. It is only when one gains that development that one can fully help others. 257. When a man touches that consciousness, he has for a time withdrawn from these lower physical levels where he can be perturbed or upset, and he is himself part of the divine joy. When he comes back again into his mental, astral and physical bodies, he may permit little troubles to annoy him. This ought not to be so. But still there is a great gap between the higher life and that lived in the physical body, where small things can still be very irritating. The possibility of being momentarily annoyed by something on the physical plane remains even when a very high level has been reached, but it is then merely superficial. The things from which people really suffer in this world are those which they feel to be hopeless. No one can ever have any feeling of hopelessness after he has touched that higher consciousness, because when we are absolutely certain that the reality is always joy, we know that all suffering at lower levels is only temporary. And that even that would not come to us if we were nearer to perfection. 258. The power of identification is gained not only with regard to the consciousness of people but with regard to everything else on the Buddhic plane. Everything is learnt from the inside instead of from the outside. If we wish to study any subject, any organism, the working of any law of nature, it does not matter what, up to and including the consciousness of the causal body, we have to study it from without, looking out at it. In the causal body we are able to examine it with an enormously widened consciousness, with the power of knowing vastly more about it than we could possibly know on lower planes. But when we get to the Buddhic plane, the difference is a fundamental difference. That which we are examining has become part of ourselves. We examine it as a kind of symptom in ourselves. It is difficult to put into words because down here we have nothing exactly like it, but this looking at things from within instead of from without does give one a very great advantage. It is so different in its characteristics that we are probably justified in saying that that is the first glimpse we get of the way in which the deity looks at his universe. Because he must have exactly that experience, that at which he looks must be part of himself because there is nothing which is not part of him. Therefore his consciousness must be this Buddhic consciousness raised to the power, and with all the insight and glory and splendor of which we can have no idea on any plane as yet. One can understand very clearly why that world is spoken of as the real, and all these lower ones as the unreal, because the difference is so great and the attitude is so entirely changed that any other way of looking at things does seem unreal. Even ridiculous when once one has learned to see them from the inside. 259. It is not so utterly impossible as many students think to attain to that higher sight. A reasonable number of people have succeeded in this incarnation, here and now, in gaining it. It is certainly within reach of those who will try hard enough, if they are willing to follow the rules, willing to adopt the utter selflessness which is required. Because so long as there is anything personal in the disciple's point of view he cannot make any progress with this Buddhic consciousness, which depends on the suppression of the personality. 260. The idea of separateness shows itself in certain ways in daily life, and it is well to watch against those manifestations. One way in which people show it very much is by their desire for power over other separated selves. One half of the world is everlastingly trying to interfere with the other half. This habit is so ingrained in us that we do not notice it, we usually regard it in the light of good advice. About one case in 2000 may happen to be that, but in most of the others we are simply asserting our separated self by endeavoring to impress ourselves upon the other people. 261. Physically, we try to make other people do things our way and to give way to us, we are perpetually trying to get them to adopt our particular plan, whatever it may be. Because it is ours, it is the best plan in the world and we want to force it upon everyone else. We find the same thing at the intellectual level. People try constantly to force their opinions and their ideas upon others. When a man has developed a keen intellect he begins subtly, slowly, to want to dominate other people by means of that intellect. Just because his thought becomes keener and stronger than that of others he tries to mold their thought by his. It is well and good that we should want to share with others all that we know, that we should set before them what we have found so good for ourselves. But as a rule that is not the idea which exists behind this desire to dominate other minds. It usually coexists with a certain amount of contempt for the other people. We think, these people are like sheep, we can sweep them along, we can make them think what we like. It is to a large extent true that a man who has learned to think, as we should be learning by meditation and study, can dominate the thoughts of others very easily. But we should not do it, because anything like domination is bad for the other man's evolution and not good for our own. So even this desire for intellectual domination must be resisted. It is part of the vice of separateness. 262. When we have got rid of that there is still a higher possibility along that line, in the realm of the spiritual we may also try to make people take our path. That is at the back of all endeavor to convert people from one religion to another. It is perhaps not quite fair to put it in that way, because Christianity at least starts with the gigantic delusion that unless people believe its particular shibboleths they will have a very unpleasant hereafter. Therefore its attempt to convert others comes to have the color of altruism. It assumes, orthodoxy is my doxy and heterodoxy is your doxy, and, what I believe is true and you must come into line with it. When we have developed spirituality, when we have learned many things that others do not know, it is right and proper that we should preach our gospel. That we should wish to tell others what we have found and give them every opportunity to follow us into these realms of higher thought. But if that wish is tinged with a desire to dominate them, a desire that is often found along with many good qualities, there is still a touch of the old separated self about it, and the giant weed is not finally uprooted. 263. We must also get rid entirely of the wish to dominate others because so long as a man is working for the separated self he belongs to that great mass of separated selves which is such a terrible burden in evolution. The moment he begins to realize the unity, he ceases to be part of the weight which has to be lifted and begins to be one of the lifters. 264. To stand alone and isolated means that one must not be dependent on anyone outside oneself, because no separated person or thing can really ultimately be of use to us. Help must be found within ourselves. The Master can help us all the time in our efforts, but even he cannot do the actual work for us. He is constantly suggesting things to us, pouring help into us in every way, but at every step it is we ourselves who must do the work. As we go on we must learn to stand apparently entirely alone, without the Master's direct help, but that is an illusion because no one can ever really be separated from the Master, or from the deity of whom that Master is a part. Still, we must act as though we were alone, and at certain stages in our evolution we shall feel absolutely alone. Yet if we can bring the intellect to bear upon it, though it is a difficult matter under such circumstances, we at once recognize that we never can be really alone. We are part of God and cannot cease to be so, because if we did we should altogether cease to be, we should be unconscious. 265. We are part of something which can never cease to be, and therefore the idea of loneliness is an illusion, though it causes great pain and suffering. On the physical plane a man is often least alone when he thinks himself most alone. When he is in the midst of a crowd the higher things can touch him less easily, therefore he is more separated from them. But when these separated selves are not so close around him the influences of the non-separated self can play upon him much more fully, and so it is really true to say that the man is least of all alone when he thinks or feels himself most alone. 266. It is hardly possible to form any conception of the awful feeling of being absolutely alone in the universe, a point floating in space. That is the condition called avicii, which means the waveless state. It is a condition of consciousness in which a man appears to himself to stand outside the vibrations of the divine life, and is said to be the most terrible experience that can come to a man. That is the end of the black magician, who for many lives has striven definitely and determinately for separateness, who has directly set himself against the unifying forces of evolution. The pupil of the Master must learn to sympathize even with the black magician who suffers avicii. Therefore once in his development a man must experience that state of consciousness. He touches it only for a moment but he can never forget it, and henceforth he will always be able to understand the suffering of those who remain for ages in such a condition as that. When for us that moment comes, we should remember that whatever is God, and that we cannot be separated from him even though we feel that we are. We must realize that it is a final illusion which must be conquered. 267. We all have to stand alone and isolated because each of us must learn to depend upon himself and to realize that he is God, that the divine spark in him is in truth part of the all. Until we can do that we are not entirely reliable for the higher phases of the Master's work. In the meantime, for all our ordinary work in life, whether physical, astral or mental, the knowledge that the Master envelopes us and is close behind us all the time is a very great strength and comfort. We do our regular work each night on the astral or mental plane, as the case may be, and in doing it we know always that the power of the Master protects us. If at any moment we encounter something enormously stronger than ourselves which threatens to overwhelm us, just as on the physical plane a great storm or earthquake might do, we always know that we can draw indefinitely, infinitely, on his power. Even that the disciple must learn to do without, when the time comes, but only in order that he may become as strong a center as the Master himself. 268. Do not fancy you can stand aside from the bad man or the foolish man. They are yourself, though in a less degree than your friend or your Master. But if you allow the idea of separateness from any evil thing or person to grow up within you, by so doing you create karma, which will bind you to that thing or person till your soul recognizes that it cannot be isolated. 269, CWL. This is the first part of a long note by the Master Hilarion. Of course we all hold in theory that humanity is a mighty brotherhood and is really a unity. The Master here admits that there are degrees in this unity, and that there are therefore degrees of separateness, that we are to some extent more separated from the bad and the foolish than we are from our friend or our Master. The idea of the brotherhood of man is often twisted to imply the equality of man, which it really cannot mean. In any family of many brothers there must be considerable differences of age among them, and there must similarly be differences of soul age among these members of the greater human brotherhood. Again, just as in the physical family it is the business of the elder to help and train the younger, so in the family of humanity must the elder protect the younger and help them in any way they can. Brotherhood implies variety. It requires this difference of age, and also that many people shall be doing different kinds of work. 270. One of the finest symbols of brotherhood that I have come across was a vision of one of our members of an Eastern temple supported by many hundreds of pillars. He said, "All these pillars are helping to support the temple, and they are therefore symbols of individual souls who form a part of the temple of humanity. Some of these pillars are on the outside, are seen and admired all the time. They also face the sunshine and the rain. Others are far away in the interior of the forest of pillars, never having the sun shining directly upon them at all, never being admired by people as they pass. Some of these pillars are in places where the worshippers gather round and sit leaning against the plinth of the pillar all day long. Other pillars are in less approachable places, but each one is an integral part of the temple and is doing its work. That is like the brotherhood of humanity. Some people may feel that they are doing a great deal. Others may never know of a single opportunity of help that comes to them, and yet they are all bearing their part and are just as much pillars in the temple as those which are more prominent in the public eye. 271. Many of our students are eager to claim unity with the Master and the saints, and not so anxious to claim unity with the criminal, the drunkard, the inefficient, the sensual, the cruel. But since humanity is one, we must be one with the less evolved people as well as with the greater. In the one case there is a part of ourselves towards which we must reach up, but in the other case there is a part of humanity which we must try to help. How can we help them? First of all by thinking in the right way about them. If we shrink from them with horror, if we hate them, we are making their path more difficult. If we allow the natural and justifiable feeling with regard to the evil that is being done to influence our attitude towards the person who does it, we are making an error. It is scarcely possible to avoid that sometimes, but we can always to some extent reason ourselves out of it. 272. Doctors meet with cases of the most loathsome and horrible diseases, which in many an instance the man concerned has brought entirely upon himself. But no doctor who is really earnest in his work thinks of that when the patient is before him. He does not shrink from the man with horror, but regards the disease as an enemy that has to be fought and conquered. That is a very good example of the attitude that we ought to be able to adopt when we have to deal with a degraded person. Undoubtedly the probabilities are that we could not produce very much effect upon an absolutely degraded drunkard, whose will is almost gone, but to shrink from him in horror or to feel contempt is not the way to help him. In the same way when a man commits a terrible crime we may have the greatest possible horror of the crime, but not of the criminal. It is difficult for us to separate them, but we have to do it. 273. There is another curious little point about that. The things which horrify us most are those to which we have a certain leaning ourselves, from which we are conceivably in danger. When one is absolutely free from the slightest tendency towards a particular crime one looks down on it without horror. But if one feels oneself filled with horror at a particular human failing, he may take it that it is a fault which has been a real danger to himself not long ago, perhaps a life or two back. 274. When we go among evil influences we sometimes have to surround ourselves with a shell in order to keep them off. That is often the best policy, since we are still very human. But to have to do that is to a certain extent a confession of weakness. 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 5, ch. 6, Service. The absolutely strong man walks straight into the middle of all these perils, certain that they cannot affect him, but that would not be a wise thing for all of us to do. Our force is limited and by making a shell we can save ourselves from using up a certain amount of it unnecessarily. A man who is perfectly sure of his own power can walk unharmed among all sorts of dangers, because he is sure of himself. Perfect strength destroys all shrinking. We draw back from a case of infectious disease because we are afraid we may catch it, if we were certain we were immune from that disease the idea of catching it would not occur to us. 275. The idea that we must not think of ourselves as separate from the wicked or the foolish man does not necessarily imply that we must always be in close association with such people, though contact is sometimes useful. There are many good people who endeavor, in a great city like London, for example, to help the poor by going to live among them in the slums. Some of our students hold the opinion that that is also our duty with regard to the wicked and the foolish people. That is not always the best way to help them. We may learn from the Master's conduct in that respect. The great ones do not come down and live in the slums of our great cities. Why do they not do so? For one reason, they would be unable to carry on their work for humanity. It would take nearly all the time of the Master to clear a place where he could work at all, and the amount of work done would be reduced to perhaps 1/100th part of what it would otherwise be. 276. So with us. It is not in the least necessary that we should put ourselves into the worst conditions. On the contrary, we can often help more effectively by not hampering ourselves in that way. If a man finds himself in a peculiarly unpleasant crowd, perhaps filled with some savage feeling or outburst of passion, he can throw a shell round himself and so protect himself from the evil influence. But he cannot do very much with that crowd while he is occupied in doing that. On the other hand, if he were away from it he would be able to pour more force upon it. Even then, if a crowd of undeveloped men is under the sway of some crude passion, very little can be done with it from higher planes, because the force poured out could hardly affect it while it was in that state. Therefore we need not enter evil surroundings unless we see clearly that we can do definite good there, although we must do the best we can if we find ourselves in such an environment. I have heard, for example, of preachers who have gone into drinking saloons and started a religious service, and there have been cases where such a bold move as that was actually successful. There would, of course, be many occasions when such a procedure would end in a fiasco. In these things, as in war, a very bold and apparently rash move may occasionally turn out well, but usually more can be accomplished by working in a reasonable way. 277. Remember that the sin and shame of the world are your sin and shame. For you are a part of it, your karma is inextricably interwoven with the great karma. 278. We do not realize that down here, but on reaching the Buddhic plane we see that it represents a real truth. There we feel, I am part of that which humanity cannot avoid, something exists in it which is a shame to me, and we feel it so because we as part of humanity have caused it. On the other hand we have our share in every good that has been done. When one man has taken a step forward we feel it as a triumph for all, through him all humanity has come a little nearer to its goal. 279. And before you can attain knowledge you must have passed through all places, foul and clean alike. Therefore, remember that the soiled garment you shrink from touching may have been yours yesterday, may be yours tomorrow. And if you turn with horror from it, when it is flung upon your shoulders, it will cling the more closely to you. The self-righteous man makes for himself a bed of mire. Abstain because it is right to abstain, not that yourself shall be kept clean. 280. This passage, with which the Master Hilarian's note concludes, has often been misunderstood. Some people have interpreted it to mean that each individual at some time must have committed all possible sins. It does not mean that, because the wise man does learn something from the experience of others. When we have seen a person burnt by putting his hand in the fire we need not put our own hand into it also before we are sure it is not a good thing to do. 1 Anti. Volume 2, page 106. So we need not commit all possible crimes in order to make up our minds about them. We have all at some stage of evolution risen from a primitive human condition and have passed through the various stages of life between that and our present condition, but there is no reason to assume that we did badly in each stage. There is some reason to suppose that most of us in the course of our long series of lives have sampled the different types of mistakes which it is possible for a human being to make, but we certainly did not go through every detail. When one form of a particular evil is touched, that, I think, stands to the wise soul as experience of a wide range of similar mistakes. 22 Anti. Volume 2, page 106. 281. then there is another consideration. Every man when he reaches the Buddhic consciousness looks out through that and experiences all that others experience. We think of the glory and the wonder of the Buddhic consciousness because it brings us into union with the Masters. We must not forget that it also brings us into harmony with the vicious and the criminal. Their feelings must be experienced, as well as the glory and the splendor of the higher life. So when we are able to touch the Buddhic plane, we may gain experience of the lower and more unpleasant aspects of life by entering into the consciousness of the people who are going through those particular phases. We do not require to do this as a lesson, because we already know by the hypothesis that these are things which are impossible for us. But we must have sufficient experience to be perfectly sympathetic, or we cannot give help to others. The perfectly sympathetic person knows intuitively the difficulties and temptations of others, and so is full of love even for the erring one. By sympathy he makes the soiled garment his own. When we have finally abandoned separateness and realized unity, we shall find that we are merged in the divine life, and that the attitude of love is the only one which we can adopt towards any of our fellow men, whether they be high or low. 282. 6. Kill out desire for sensation. 283. Learn from sensation and observe it, because only so can you commence the science of self-knowledge, and plant your foot on the first step of the ladder. 284. A.B. The disciple must observe the working of sensation in himself, so that he may gain some self-knowledge from it. He can attain to such knowledge only by the deliberate study of his own thoughts. The first effect of trying to study your own thoughts is to stand away from them, to separate them from yourself. The very fact of your studying them has drawn your life away from them, so as to destroy for the time being the identification of yourself with your thoughts which habitually exists. A man does not identify himself with the object of his study, with the thing at which he is looking. It is a saying among the followers of Shankaracharya that subject and object can never be the same. So the very effort of study weakens the forms, and in that mere act you are gaining freedom. 285. Closely allied to this advice is the instruction to test experiences, the object being that the man may experience the condition of being no longer affected by them. When a man is observing his own sensation, in order to learn from it, he may experience that sensation, but at the same time he may do with it something higher, he may measure this force without yielding to it. There will come times too, when the disciple who is practicing this observation of sensations will find that dormant sensations in himself are being reawakened. 286. All of us have reminiscences of the past, which may be said to hang about us as our dead selves, and are liable to be revivified from outside. They may come to life again by contact with other men's thought forms along the same lines, or they may be awakened by the deliberate action of some power which is working for our purification. Or is testing us either from the dark or the white side. Suppose a man has that dead self vivified, he will then feel what is usually called the force of temptation. The disciple, having studied the way in which these things work, recognizes what has happened. He measures the power of the resuscitated thought and says to it, "You are not my living self, you are merely my I of the past, so get away from me." 287. Sometimes in a moment of temptation it is helpful to recognize that it is merely your past that has been revivified, and then you are right to say, "This is not I." Then you look on it as outside yourself, as no part of your being or activity, and you know that it cannot hold you or stain you. 1 Anti. Volume 2, page 154, 315. The patient confidence that arises from this knowledge has a great element of strength in it. You know that you are drawing nearer the time when you will not even feel this temptation. Presently it will not have the power to affect you at all. 288. In the deliberate process of weighing, measuring, and observing his own past feelings and thoughts, the disciple is killing the very last possibility of life in that dead self. The voice of the silence means this, when it says with regard to desire, "Take heed lest from the dead it should again arise." The old feelings and thoughts are done with, not when they are merely buried out of sight, but when the very last fragment of them is worked out to the end. When the man looks at them and sees with perfect clearness just what they are and that they are no part of himself. In this quiet study he then kills them beyond all possibility of recall to life. 289, CWL, we have first to learn to observe the working of sensation in ourselves from outside. So long as we are being swept away by it we cannot learn anything from it, because we are then slaves to it, but if we can rise and look down upon it, and think of it as something belonging to our past, we are then in a position to observe and study it. 290, waves of sensation are flowing all over the world and we have to learn to understand them so as to be able to help others, but of course we can do that only when we are no longer swayed by them. Doubtless it is largely a matter of temperament, but for many it is one of the greatest difficulties that sensations and emotions swirl them about, and as yet they do not understand fully how to control them. It is like standing in the breakers and trying to master them. A man cannot govern a thing which knocks him over again and again and sweeps him away. But people do not realize that emotion is really not an external force like that, but that it is within oneself and may be brought perfectly within one's control if one understands how to do it. 291. The way is to get a firm grip on it in the very beginning. A wave of anger, depression, jealousy, or any of these passions will start in a moment and grow rapidly into a very big thing. It comes up so suddenly and people are so accustomed to regard it as the self that they do not for the moment recognize it, and so do not at once pull up and stop it, and say, "This is not I decline to be swept away, I stand firm." If we remember to do that in time the emotion disappears promptly. Most people make the resolve not